Hi friends, welcome back. I can't thank you enough for all your support and kind comments. They truly mean the world to me. Right now, we're just 200 subscribers away from reaching 4,000, and I would be so grateful for your help to get there. Please subscribe, give a like, and leave a comment. Every bit of your support really makes a difference. Thank you again for being here and supporting me, and now let's get started. My name is Dakota Rivers, and I've been a ranger at Yellowstone for 18 months. That seems like a short time to say you know a place, but in those 18 months I've learned that the wilderness doesn't measure time the way people do. It measures it in seasons, in the behavior of animals, in the subtle shift of weather patterns that announce themselves weeks before they arrive. Time is different out here. It moves slower. It accumulates differently. You feel it in your bones before you understand it in your mind. I took this job because I needed to disappear. That's not poetic. That's not some metaphorical statement about finding myself in nature or rediscovering my roots, though I'm sure plenty of people would interpret it that way. I mean it literally. I needed to become someone else, a person without a history, someone whose only existence was defined by the specific geography of a national park and the repetitive cycles of ranger work. I was running from a marriage that had become toxic, from a career in hotel management that had hollowed me out, from a city where I kept seeing my ex-wife's face on strangers' bodies. My father was Lakota, though he died when I was 12, and my mother never spoke about our heritage. But somewhere in my DNA, the mountains called me louder than anything else ever could. The job posting came across my screen at 3 in the morning, 2 weeks after my divorce was finalized. Yellowstone was looking for seasonal rangers to help with the summer visitor season. The pay was modest, the work was physical. The nearest town was 30 miles away. It was perfect. I applied that same night, and they hired me within a week. I think they appreciated that I didn't ask many questions. Now it's late September, and I'm assigned to one of the more remote patrol zones. My jurisdiction spans roughly 40 square miles of wilderness that includes the area around Pelican Creek and a complex of isolated lakes that see maybe 50 visitors a year. Most rangers spend their time checking in on established campgrounds, managing the flow of tourists, responding to bear warnings. I spend my time alone. There's a cabin where I stay 3 nights a week, a small structure built in 1987 that sits at the edge of a lake that has no name on any official maps. People call it Basin Lake because of the way the surrounding mountains curve around it like hands cradling something fragile. The Park Service asked me to work the late summer season extending into fall. Fewer visitors, more wildlife activity, more potential for problems. I was the only one crazy enough to volunteer for it. The solitude was exactly what I wanted. I didn't expect the cabin to feel so isolating. The first month was fine, routine. I'd patrol the accessible trails, check on campsites, file reports about wildlife sightings and vegetation conditions. I was establishing myself as competent, professional, trustworthy. At night, I'd sit on the porch with the lake in front of me, a lake so still it looked like black glass under the stars, and I'd feel something like peace. The mountains rose up behind the cabin, dark pyramids against a darker sky. At certain times of night, you could hear the elk calling from the higher elevations. The sound was like nothing else, a bellow that seemed to come from the earth itself. But peace isn't real. It's just a temporary suspension of awareness. And by late August, my awareness was starting to shift. Small things first. The deer patterns changed. For the first few weeks, there had been a doe and her yearling fawn that came down to the lake edge every evening to drink. I'd see them from the cabin window, graceful and cautious, the fawn still spotted with the remnants of its summer coat. Then one week, they stopped coming. Not gradually, they were just gone. I didn't think much about it. Deer move, it's what they do. The Park Service guides teach you that animals aren't tied to specific locations. They migrate, they follow food and safety, but the way they disappeared bothered me. It wasn't a gradual trailing off. It was abrupt, like someone had switched them off. September brought cold nights and a clarity to the air that made distance collapse. You could see 10 miles from the cabin's porch in certain directions, see the individual trees on the far ridge, see the shadows of clouds moving across the valley. The light changed too, becoming sharper and more severe. The sun seemed lower even when it was directly overhead. I'd read somewhere that this is because of the angle of approach, the specific geometry of the Earth's tilt at this latitude during this season. But knowing the reason didn't make it less unsettling. The sounds changed with September. The frequent calls of the elk grew less common. I attributed this to the rut beginning to wind down, but the silence felt wrong. There were nights when I'd sit on the porch and the only sounds would be wind through the pines and the occasional small animal movement in the underbrush. No birds after dusk, none. Usually you could hear the owls calling back and forth across the darkness, these deep resonant hoots that echoed off the mountains. Now there was just wind and my own breathing. The second week of September, I found the elk. I was doing a routine patrol of Pelican Creek, walking the ridge trail that overlooks the northern slope of my assigned zone. The elk carcass was in a small clearing about 200 meters from the trail, positioned with its body aligned perfectly north to south. That was the first thing I noticed. The body wasn't sprawled or positioned as if the animal had died in place. Someone had arranged it, or something. The elk was a young bull, maybe 5 years old. The antlers were still in velvet, the soft covering that precedes the hardening of the rack. That meant it was early in the season. This animal should have been alive and feeding, building strength for the coming rut. The carcass itself was clean, no vulture activity, no scavenger marks. The hide was intact, the internal cavity sealed. Whatever had killed it hadn't fed. That was wrong. Every predator I knew of in Yellowstone had a signature. Grizzly bears tore into carcasses with violence, leaving long claw marks and scattered remains. Wolves were organized and methodical, consuming organs first and leaving hides and bones in specific patterns. Cougars ate the hindquarters first and covered kills with branches and vegetation. This elk looked like it had simply been placed here after dying somewhere else. I called it in to the ranger station. Mark Hendricks, the regional supervisor, said to leave it alone and let nature take its course. If it's recent, the scavengers will move in fast once the carcass starts decomposing, he said over the radio. I didn't argue, but I marked the location on my GPS and decided to check it again in 3 days. When I returned, the carcass was gone. No blood trail, no signs of dragging, just an empty clearing with some flattened grass where the body had been. 3 days later, I found another one. This time it was a mule deer, an older doe. Same positioning, same perfect alignment, same absence of any feeding marks. I found this one about a mile from the first location, which meant whatever was happening was moving across my assigned territory. I reported this one too. Mark told me it was probably bears caching kills. I let him believe that. By late September, I'd found 6 more carcasses. Always large herbivores. Always perfectly intact. Always arranged in that same careful, deliberate way. And each time I returned to check a location, the animal would be gone, removed by something with the organization to carry multi-hundred-pound bodies across uneven terrain without leaving visible evidence of their passing. But the worst part wasn't the carcasses, it was the behavior of the living animals. I started noticing that the remaining wildlife was changing how it moved. The mule deer that still inhabited the lower elevations started running in tight circles instead of moving in their normal feeding patterns. I watched one doe for nearly an hour from a distance. It would graze for about 30 seconds, then suddenly bolt 50 meters in a complete circle before stopping and grazing again. When I scanned the area with binoculars trying to understand what was triggering this behavior, I could find nothing. No predators, no disturbances. Just the deer responding to something I couldn't perceive. The black bears were worse. I saw a sow with 2 cubs on the western shore of the lake around twilight. She was moving in a way that looked like agitation, her head turning rapidly side to side as if tracking something. The cubs stayed behind her, not playing or exploring as young bears usually do. The sow kept them close, and when she finally moved away from the lake, she left the area at a speed that seemed inappropriate for a browsing bear. She moved like something was chasing her, but there was nothing there, just empty forest and the sound of her movement fading through the trees. That night, from the cabin I heard voices in the dark, not human voices, I can't describe them in those terms. They were closer to howls than anything else, but they had a certain musicality to them that howls don't possess. They were deliberately shaped, they contained modulation and intentionality. They seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, making it impossible to triangulate their source. The sound filled the space around the cabin with a density that made my skin prickle. I sat on the porch for 40 minutes, listening to these sounds move through the forest like something searching for the right frequency. Then they stopped. The silence afterward was so complete it felt like a held breath. The cabin suddenly felt very small. The third week of September, I had a visitor. This was unusual. I rarely saw other people in my patrol zone. The few hikers who came through were generally lost, having taken wrong turns on trails that weren't clearly marked. But this person wasn't lost. He appeared at the cabin around dawn. A man maybe in his 60s, wearing the kind of clothes you'd buy at an REI outlet rather than actual outdoor wear. His windbreaker was bright blue, and his hiking boots were still stiff, unworn. He'd driven up from the south, he explained, taking the road that technically park. He had permits, though he didn't show them. He was interested in the area around the lake because of some historical significance related to wildlife mortality events that had been documented in the 1990s. Something about him made me uncomfortable, not because of anything he said explicitly, but because of the careful way he said things. Every sentence seemed rehearsed. He asked very specific questions about which trails were most used, where I'd seen animals, whether I'd noticed any behavioral anomalies. When I told him about the deer running in circles, he became very still, his eyes changed. It was subtle, just a momentary shift, but I caught it. Recognition, maybe. Or confirmation. "Have you gone out at night?" he asked. "Specifically, have you noticed anything unusual in the forest after dark?" I told him I had heard sounds. I described the vocalizations without calling them voices. He nodded slowly. "What did the sounds remind you of?" I didn't answer immediately. What had they reminded me of? Coyotes didn't sound like that. Wolves don't either. Elk have that distinctive bugling call that they use during the rut, but this had been different. It had been almost linguistic in structure, the way the tones rose and fell. "They sounded like someone imitating an animal," I finally said. Richard stood up. He was shorter than I'd realized, and something about his posture made him look older than his face suggested. "You should consider transferring to a different zone," he said. "I'm serious. There are some areas of the park that have conditions. This is one of them. The park doesn't officially acknowledge it, but people who know, and anyone with sense gets transferred out." "What kind of conditions?" I asked. "The kind that exist outside official documentation. The kind that the Park Service prefers to pretend don't exist because acknowledging them would mean dealing with them, and dealing with them would require admitting that this park isn't entirely under their control." He looked out the cabin window toward the lake. "This area has had an unusually high concentration of incidents, missing persons, animals found in states that don't make sense, ranger disappearances." Ranger disappearances? I'd never heard anything about this. Quietly reassigned or retired, officially moved to other positions. But the pattern is consistent. Someone spends more than a few weeks in this zone, and they either leave or they stop existing in ways that can be explained by normal attrition. He turned back to me. "When was the last time you saw another living person out here? I mean, besides me?" I thought about this. I'd been assigned to this zone for 18 months. In that time, I'd encountered maybe 20 hikers total. One ranger passed through once, no one else, no hunters, because this is a protected area. No researchers before Richard. Just me and the animals and the land. "What happens to them?" I asked. Richard didn't answer directly. Instead, he told me about a ranger from the 1980s named Marcus Webb. Webb had worked a zone very similar to mine about 15 miles to the east. He'd been out here for one season when he started filing unusual incident reports. Wildlife in distress, unexplained animal deaths, strange sounds. The park sent someone to investigate. When they arrived at Webb's cabin, they found his logs and his equipment, but Webb was gone. They found one personal item near the lake's edge, a single boot. Webb had disappeared in 1987. His remains were never found. The official report said he'd probably drowned and been carried downstream. But there were problems with that explanation. The boot was found on the opposite shore from where a drowning victim would have washed up given the water current patterns. "There have been others," Richard said. "Not documented, not official. But if you talk to the old-timers, if you really press them, you'll hear stories. They talk about something that hunts in the deep forest, something that's learned to mimic animal behavior, something that's very patient about its hunting." "You're talking about a cryptid," I said. "Bigfoot, skinwalker, something out of folklore." "I'm talking about something that the Park Service doesn't understand and doesn't want to understand. Whether you call it folklore or biology doesn't matter. What matters is that it exists, that it operates in specific zones, and that the Park Service has learned to simply rotate rangers through those zones quickly enough that the problem doesn't become public knowledge." I wanted to dismiss this. It sounded like conspiracy thinking, like someone who'd spent too much time alone in the wilderness and had started constructing elaborate explanations for simple phenomena. But I'd found 6 bodies arranged in patterns that no known predator would arrange them. I'd heard voices that didn't belong to anything in the animal kingdom. I'd watched prey animals respond to threats I couldn't perceive. Richard left the cabin that afternoon. Before he drove away, he told me one more thing. "If you stay, don't go out after dark. If you see something that doesn't make sense, don't investigate it. And if you hear something that sounds almost like it's calling your name, don't answer. They're very good at voices. I didn't ask him what they were. Some part of me already knew. By early October, I'd found 14 bodies. I stopped reporting them after the 8th one. Mark had made it clear he didn't want to deal with it, and I didn't want to draw more attention to my zone. The bodies were positioned now across a pattern that made my skin crawl when I plotted them on my patrol map. They formed almost a geometric arrangement, with my cabin very close to the center point. It was as if something was creating a perimeter, establishing a boundary. Each carcass was slightly more deteriorated than it should have been, but never scavenged. It was as if whatever killed them also prevented scavengers from approaching. The sounds continued every night. They'd begun around dusk and continue until just before dawn. The vocalizations were becoming more complex. There were patterns to them now, almost musical structures. They seemed to be concentrating in frequency around the cabin. I would sit inside with the lights off, trying not to move, trying to make myself as invisible as possible while whatever was out there called through the darkness. One night, I heard one of the voices say something that sounded exactly like my name. It was my voice, my exact inflection, not close enough to be an approximation, but a perfect reproduction. The voice came from the woods behind the cabin, and it called out, "Takoda, come here, Takoda." The intonation was mine, the pattern of speech was mine. It was like hearing myself speak from outside my own body. I didn't move. I didn't answer. I sat in the darkness for 3 hours until the voice stopped calling and the forest fell silent again. But I hadn't slept right since. The weather turned cold. The first snow fell on October 7th, just enough to dust the mountains, enough to make the air feel sharper and more lethal. The animals that had shown strange behavior seemed to have disappeared entirely from my zone. I saw maybe 1 deer a day now, and they would move quickly away when they caught any sign of me. The birds were completely gone. The lake had taken on a quality that made me uncomfortable looking at it for too long. The water was too clear, too still, as if it had been treated with something that prevented normal rippling. On October 10th, I decided to walk to the northern edge of my territory, about 12 miles from the cabin. I wanted to see if the phenomenon was localized or if it extended across a larger area. I took supplies for a full day, left before dawn, and moved as quickly as I could through terrain that didn't tolerate speed. What I found at the boundary of my territory was a cluster of more bodies, not animals, human remains, or what had been human remains. There were at least 3 of them, scattered across a quarter-mile radius, positioned in that same careful geometric arrangement. The bodies were advanced in decomposition, but the precision of their placement was absolute. This wasn't a hiker who'd fallen or gotten lost. This was deliberate positioning. The clothing suggested these people had been there for years. I found a ranger badge near one of the skeletons, the name still visible on a weathered laminate. Marcus Webb, 1987. I didn't stay in that place long. I marked the location, photographed it with my Ranger issue camera, and began the walk back to the cabin. It took me 12 hours. I moved too fast, didn't rest enough, pushed myself to the point where my vision started going blurry. The sun was setting as I approached the cabin, and in that diminishing light I could see that something had been waiting for me. The forest around the cabin looked wrong. The trees seemed to have shifted somehow, the angles of the branches all oriented toward where the building stood. The ground around the structure was marked with patterns that looked deliberate, concentric circles of disturbed earth and vegetation that seemed to have been walked into the ground by repeated passage. The cabin door was open. I knew I'd locked it. I'm certain I'd locked it. Inside, everything was undisturbed, but there was a smell, something organic and old, something that made me think of decomposition, and something else, something that didn't have an easy category. On the table in the main room, laid out in a line, were 7 items: a ranger badge, a boot, a watch, a button, a piece of fabric, a knife, and a photograph. The photograph was of me. It was taken from outside the cabin, through the window where I sat, reading. I had no idea when it had been taken. I packed everything I could carry into my ranger pack, including my laptop and personal documents, grabbed my keys, and walked to my truck. It was parked in the small clearing where I always left it. As I was loading my gear, I noticed something under the windshield wiper. A note written in handwriting that looked like mine. It said, "You've been here long enough." I drove out of that zone that night and didn't stop until I reached the ranger station in Gardner. I told Mark I was requesting an immediate transfer. When he asked why, I told him it was a family emergency, which was technically true. My emergency was the primary fact of my own existence, my need to remain alive and sane. The transfer came through a week later. I'm stationed now at the north entrance doing administrative work and visitor services. I can see mountains from my office, but they're the wrong mountains. The work is monotonous and safe. No one here is interested in the deep zones. No one here has stories about what happens to rangers who stay too long in certain areas. I gave the photographs and documentation of what I found to the park's biological director, Dr. Coleman. He took the materials, looked at them for maybe 30 seconds, and told me the zone was being closed for the season due to a water contamination issue. The closure notice went up, and my old territory is now officially off limits to visitors and rangers alike. I never heard what happened to the remains I found, or whether anyone confirmed Marcus Webb's death certificate or investigated what had killed him. The park has a way of absorbing these incidents, of letting them sink into the accumulated geological time of the landscape where they become indistinguishable from ordinary stone and earth. But the thing I need to explain, the thing that makes me know I haven't actually escaped, is what continues to happen to me now that I've left. The vocalizations have stopped, but they've been replaced by something worse. I'll be walking through the administrative building, and I'll see someone out of the corner of my eye who looks exactly like me. Not close, exactly, same gait. Same proportions, same face, but when I turn to look directly, they're gone, or they're not there, which amounts to the same thing. And every night, I can still hear my own voice calling from somewhere outside my apartment window. Not words, just my name, repeated in my own intonation, carried on wind that shouldn't exist at this elevation. The sounds have followed me. They've tracked me like I'm radioactive, like leaving the physical location meant nothing because I was already marked. Mark Hendricks, the ranger who supervised my assignment, told me something 3 days ago. He said that the Park Service doesn't believe in removing threats. They redistribute them. They move rangers in and out of certain zones on schedules designed to prevent any single person from learning too much or staying too long. The zones themselves can't be abandoned because the park is a network of territories, and each territory serves a function. The deep zones, the problem zones, they're monitored but not managed. They're contained by a kind of calculated negligence and official acknowledgement that certain parts of the park are essentially wild in a way that goes beyond normal wildlife management. What's in those zones? I asked him. The places where we don't get to decide what happens, Mark said. The places where the park belongs to something other than the National Park Service. We maintain the roads and the visitor centers and the campsites. But the deep forest? That's not ours. We just patrol the edges and hope we can keep the tourists in the designated areas. I quit my job at the Park Service 3 weeks ago. I'm thinking about moving west, maybe Montana or Idaho, somewhere that isn't managed by anyone, somewhere that hasn't been divided into zones and territories. But I'm not naive. I know that doesn't actually change anything. The wilderness exists everywhere, and the things that live in the deep places of the wilderness don't recognize jurisdictional boundaries. Sometimes I wake up in the night, and I can feel something standing at the foot of my bed. When I turn on the light, nothing's there. But the air feels disturbed, like something has just moved, and I can smell that same organic decomposition smell, fainter now but still present. Still following. I took the job because I needed to disappear. Instead, I learned that some disappearances aren't destinations. They're states of being. I'm still here, I'm still at my address, paying my bills, functioning as a normal person, but some part of me remained in that cabin at the edge of Basin Lake. Some part of me is still being called to in my own voice from the darkness beyond the line where official jurisdiction ends. Richard was right about one thing. The park doesn't acknowledge what exists in those deep zones. It simply accepts them as part of the landscape, the way we accept that some mountains are too steep to climb and some weather is too extreme to endure. You don't fight the wilderness. You just rotate personnel through it until no one person accumulates enough knowledge to make the situation public. But the wilderness remembers. And the things in the wilderness have very long memories. They don't forget the people they mark. They don't forget which direction you ran. And they understand that distance is just another kind of permission. I hear them tonight. They're outside, calling in voices that sound exactly like people I used to know. My mother. My ex-wife. My father, even though he's been dead for 45 years, they're singing something that almost sounds like a lullaby, except the melody has edges that cut. And I'm starting to understand that the hardest part of disappearing is that eventually, the things you were trying to escape from figure out how to disappear with you. The wilderness always wins. You don't leave it, you just carry it forward until it decides it's time to stop carrying you. I took the job at the Appalachian Forest Service District office on a Tuesday in March, when the mountains were still the color of wet concrete and the wind cut through my jacket like it had teeth. I was 34 years old, divorced, and carrying the kind of exhaustion that comes from 5 years managing tourist behavior at a busy national park out west. Yellowstone had broken me in ways I didn't want to admit. The crowds, the entitled visitors, the constant regulatory compliance. The way people treated the park like a shopping mall they owned. The district supervisor, a man named Malcolm, sat behind a desk covered in topographic maps and incident reports. He was in his 60s, weathered in that way mountain people are weathered, like the land had literally carved itself into his face. "Why would you take a step down?" he asked, not looking up from my application. "Yellowstone to Appalachian? That's lateral at best, backward at worst." I told him the truth. I said I needed quiet. I said I wanted to work in a place where the wilderness was still largely untouched, where I could walk a patrol without seeing drone footage on someone's phone or hearing arguments about whether bears had legal rights. I said I wanted to be useful in a way that mattered. What I didn't tell him was that I'd started seeing people who weren't there. Hikers at the tree line with wrong proportions. Visitors in the lodge at 3 a.m. who'd vanished by morning. The park ranger's daughter I'd found standing in her cabin at midnight with no memory of leaving her bedroom. I'd attended too many search and rescue operations that ended badly. I'd held too many incident reports describing disappearances that made no tactical sense. Malcolm hired me on the spot. Told me I'd regret it by November. Told me the Appalachian wilderness wasn't a romantic refuge, it was a furnace that burned things down to essentials. "Some men come here to find themselves," he said, walking me to the door. "Most find something else instead." The ranger station sat at the edge of a valley called Black Rock Hollow, tucked between two ridges that rose like the walls of something massive and old. The cabin assigned to me was 7 miles in, accessible only by the main ranger road and a network of hiking trails that appeared on the map like capillaries. It had been built in 1963 as temporary housing for fire management crews. The word temporary was still accurate. It was the kind of structure that lasted exactly as long as no one demanded anything from it. The cabin was functional. Wood stove, running water from a hand pump in the kitchen, a propane generator that coughed like a consumptive. There was a lake 200 yards east through the trees, a dark wedge of water hemmed in by rhododendron and hemlock that had probably predated the reservation system. The first 3 weeks were quiet in the way that legitimate quiet is impossible. No human sounds, yes. But the forest was full of other acoustic texture. Branches fell with measured impact. Animals moved through the understory with deliberate footsteps. Water made constant adjustments in the lake. At night, the silence had a texture to it, like something with weight and presence pressing against the cabin walls. I inventoried the territory, found evidence of bear activity from winter, scat from a large black bear that had probably weighed 400 pounds. Found an old campsite near the lake, the fire ring blackened and surrounded by what looked like deliberate pacing patterns. Found a boot. Just one. Looked like it had been in the forest for months, the leather cracked and separated from the sole. I didn't report the boot. On the 22nd day, I saw the first animal. It was standing at the edge of the tree line near the lake, maybe 100 yards out from the cabin. I noticed it because of the color. It was a deer, a doe by the silhouette, but the coloration was wrong. The body was a mottled gray-brown that didn't match any regional species, and the head had that angle wrong. The proportions were off in a way I couldn't articulate. The neck was too long, the legs bent at intervals that suggested too many joints. I watched it for maybe 3 minutes. It didn't move. It just stood there facing the cabin. And I could feel something passing between us that wasn't peaceful. A recognition, maybe. Or an assessment. Then it turned and walked back into the forest with a gait that was almost mechanical. Each leg moved with exact precision, like something learning to use a biological suit it didn't entirely understand. I didn't sleep well that night. The bear attacked the ranger's vehicle on a supply run in early May. The incident report said it was territorial and malnourished, that it came through the windshield of the truck while Marcus Webb and his partner were unloading provisions at my cabin. Marcus got his forearm up and took the rake of its claws across his bicep and shoulder. The bear was killed with the service pistol. What the report didn't mention was that Marcus said the bear had the wrong eyes. It had human intelligence looking out of them. When animal control came to examine the carcass, the animal weighed 320 pounds, which was small for a black bear engaged in predatory behavior. Malcolm said bears sometimes got aggressive when they were hungry. That was normal. Marcus got infected. The infection moved fast, tracking up his arm in red lines that looked almost like a map of something. He was hospitalized in Charleston, and we heard through the district office that he'd lost some mobility in his shoulder. He didn't come back to work. I increased my patrol radius after that. Started covering more ground, moving the walking routes to include the northern territories I hadn't yet thoroughly surveyed. It was good work. It was work that kept me moving, kept me from settling, kept my mind occupied with the logistical necessities of maintaining a territory. It was during one of these longer patrols that I found the things. They were in a ravine maybe 5 miles northeast of the cabin, arranged in a loose circle around a low outcropping of stone. There were maybe 8 of them, and they were made of wood. Not crafted exactly, just wood that had been stripped of bark and broken into rough humanoid shapes, arranged deliberately, limbs positioned as if in conversation. I photographed them with my phone. The images looked thin and incomplete, like the camera didn't want to process what it was seeing. I noted the coordinates. I didn't report them. The weather turned, and June came in warm and wet. The rhododendrons bloomed along the lake in dense pink masses. Insects emerged in clouds. The forest became thick and loud with life. This was when the sounds started changing. At first I thought it was visitors. The noise came from the forest in the evening, sometimes sounding like voices in conversation. The sounds were never quite distinct enough to be actual words, but they carried the cadence of human speech, rising and falling in natural patterns. Sometimes it sounded like multiple people having an argument. Sometimes like someone calling for help. I would go to the door and listen for 10-15 minutes. The sounds would stop immediately if I made any noise. The moment I stepped back inside and closed the door, they would resume. One night in late June, I heard my name. It wasn't a whisper, it was a full voice, clear and distinct, coming from the direction of the lake. It sounded like it was being spoken by someone standing about 50 yards away just beyond the tree line. It was my name, exactly as people pronounced it, carried on the warm night air with perfect intonation. I went to the porch. The forest was dark under the tree cover, but there was enough moonlight to see the clearing around the lake. Nothing was there. I waited for 10 minutes, listening. The forest had gone completely silent. Not the normal quiet of night, but an absence of sound that felt deliberate. When I went back inside, I locked the door. I checked the windows, the locks on the back door. I loaded the service pistol from the cabin's emergency equipment and placed it on the table beside my bed. The sounds continued every night for a week. They got closer. I started to recognize patterns in them. Sometimes they sounded like conversations in a language that wasn't English but carried the same rhythmic structure. Sometimes they just sounded like breathing, amplified and repeated. One morning I woke up to find something outside my window. It was too dark to see detail, but I could see the shape of it in the faint light before dawn. It was roughly human in outline, but the proportions were subtly wrong. The arms hung slightly too long, the head seemed too large. It was standing about 6 feet from the window, completely motionless, and I could feel it looking at me even though I couldn't see the eyes. I grabbed the pistol. When I looked back, it was gone. There were no footprints in the soft earth beneath the window. I stopped going on patrols. That was stupid, and I knew it was stupid, but the thought of being out in the forest away from the cabin had started to produce a physical fear response in my chest. Tightness, difficulty breathing, the sensation of being carefully watched by something that knew my exact location and was calculating distance and time. Instead, I stayed in and worked on the incident reports. I cataloged vegetation changes. I photographed weather patterns. I made notes about animal activity that I didn't file with the main office. I was doing the work of a park ranger without actually entering the territory. Malcolm came out on the 1st of July, unannounced. He said the district office was concerned that I hadn't submitted comprehensive patrol data for 2 weeks. He was direct about it, standing in the cabin with his arms crossed, looking at me the way you might look at a piece of equipment that was starting to malfunction. "You look bad," he said. "You're not sleeping." I told him the truth. Not the detailed truth, but the functional truth. I said I'd been experiencing some unusual animal behavior in the territory. Said I was reevaluating my patrol routes to account for aggressive fauna. "The bear with the wrong eyes," he said. It wasn't a question. I didn't answer. Marcus told the investigators about that. Said the bear looked at him like it was aware of him, like it was making a choice. Malcolm moved to the window and looked out toward the lake. "This forest is old, and it's been wild longer than it's been managed. People come out here, they sometimes encounter things they don't know how to process." "What kind of things?" I asked. "The kind that don't fit in incident reports." The kind that are easier to explain as bears with territorial issues and hikers who got lost. He turned back to me. How long have you been seeing them? There was no point in lying. About a month, and they haven't done anything to you, not directly, not yet. Malcolm nodded like that confirmed something. He sat down at the table without being invited. 34 people have gone missing in this range in the last 50 years, he said. Not hikers who took the wrong trail and walked out a different way. Not people who wandered into dangerous territory and made a mistake. People who vanished from places they shouldn't have been able to vanish from. A kid on a school camping trip. A ranger doing a routine patrol like you were doing. A family of 4 camping at an established site that's supposed to be maintained. How is that possible? It's not. Which is why there's no official pattern to it, and everyone who reports it gets counseled by the district office about the importance of maintaining focus in the field. He pulled out a small notebook from his jacket. The pages were worn and handwritten, filled with coordinates and names and dates. I've been collecting information for 22 years, cross-referencing missing person reports with unusual activity reports, looking for patterns in territories where the incidents cluster. I read through some of the entries. Detailed accounts of things that didn't fit the standard narrative of wilderness danger. A family of 4 found in their tent having walked out through the walls instead of using the entrance, all still asleep. Rangers hearing their own voices calling them deeper into the woods. Campsite structures arranged in configurations that suggested they were not built by human hands. Animals that moved in ways that were biomechanically impossible. The Cherokee called them the Yanu, Malcolm said. The old people did. The shifters, the ones that wear shapes they shouldn't wear. Modern literature calls them skinwalkers, borrowed from other tribes' traditions, but the concept is the same. Something that exists in the forest and understands how to look like something else well enough to be mistaken for it. That's folklore. Yes, which makes it very useful as a working hypothesis that no one will take seriously. I drank water. My hands were shaking enough that it spilled slightly. Why are you telling me this? Because you're going to have to decide whether to stay or leave. If you stay, you need to understand what you're managing. The forest isn't trying to kill you, it's trying to integrate you. The sounds, the watching, the things at the edge of visibility, that's all preliminary, reconnaissance. They do that for days, sometimes weeks. What happens after reconnaissance? Different outcomes. Some people get integrated quickly. Their behavior changes. They start responding to things in the forest. Their reports become less coherent. Eventually, they walk out into the territory and don't come back, or someone finds them and they're not quite the same person anymore. Some people leave. That's actually the most common outcome. Fear is usually more powerful than curiosity, and these things understand that. And the rest? Malcolm closed the notebook. The rest stop existing as separate entities and become part of the system. He left before sunset, driving the ranger truck back toward town. I watched the taillights disappear around the bend where the forest moved in close against the road. The isolation felt much more complete after he left. Not the comfortable solitude I'd been seeking, but the absolute vacuum of being alone in a place where something else was also present. That night I prepared a go bag. Basic supplies, documents, the things that would let me walk out in the morning if I decided to. I set it by the door. I didn't go to bed. Instead, I sat in the cabin with all the lights on, the pistol on the table, and waited to see what would happen. Around 2 a.m., the voices came back. But they were different. They were clearer, and they were speaking my name, not calling it, speaking it. Like they were having a conversation with someone about me, using my name in the context of sentences I couldn't quite parse, discussing something about me in a language that was almost English but not quite. The tones were conversational, almost friendly. I went to the porch. The night was overcast, no moon, but there was just enough ambient light to see movement at the tree line. There were several of them, roughly humanoid shapes standing at intervals around the lake's perimeter. They weren't moving, weren't approaching, just standing there with the patience of things that had nothing but time. And I understood, standing there on the porch in the dark, what Malcolm had meant. This wasn't hunting, this was occupation. This was a territory asserting its boundaries and waiting to see if I would accept those boundaries or resist them. I picked up the phone. No signal. Of course there wasn't. I went back inside and sat in the chair and waited for morning. The light came very slowly, filtered through heavy cloud cover that had moved in overnight. The forest was gray and the lake was silver gray and the sky was gray, all one continuous muted palette that made it impossible to tell where the forest ended and the sky began. I made coffee and tried to eat. The food was sawdust in my mouth. The shapes were gone. If they had actually been there and not some kind of stress-induced hallucination, They had retreated when the light started shifting. The forest looked normal in daylight. The sounds had stopped. The watching sensation had diminished, though not disappeared entirely. I needed to make a decision. Leaving meant admitting that something in this forest was wrong in ways I didn't have vocabulary for. It meant going back to a city and trying to reintegrate into a normal life. It meant telling people why I was leaving after 2 months, and knowing they wouldn't believe me, and that Malcolm would file some kind of report about my psychological fitness, and that everything I'd experienced would be filed away as stress-induced delusion. Staying meant accepting Malcolm's framework, meant understanding that the forest I'd chosen as a refuge wasn't a refuge at all, but a place with its own intelligence, a place with its own hunger. I was still sitting with that decision when I heard the sound from the lake. It was a person calling for help, male voice, panicked, the way a person sounds when they're drowning or injured. The sound came from the direction of the water, and it had such clarity that I stood up immediately, muscle memory overriding the warning bells in my head. I grabbed the emergency pack from behind the door. I moved toward the lake without fully consciously deciding to move. My training, my instinct as a ranger, the part of me that had dedicated a decade to rescue and preservation, overrode everything else. The water was cold and dark, and I was 40 yards in before I realized I was wading, that I had kicked off my shoes without remembering doing it, that I had gone from the porch to the lake to waist-deep in water in the space of maybe 90 seconds. The voice kept calling. Male, definitely, and it sounded like someone I knew. I couldn't place the voice, but it carried the weight of familiarity. It was calling my name and saying they were hurt and asking for help. The bottom dropped away suddenly, and I went under. The water was clear in that moment, and I could see them below me. Multiple shapes arranged in a geometric pattern at the bottom of the lake. Not people, not quite anything else either. They had mass and structure, but the shapes didn't resolve into anything my brain wanted to accept. They were doing something with the water, manipulating it, and I understood in that moment that the voice calling from above, the drowning person calling my name, was coming from below. The shapes reached up simultaneously. I kicked hard and came up gasping. I was 20 yards from shore, and the weight on my legs was immediate and tangible. Something had hold of my shin, my ankle. I thrashed and pulled toward the cabin, and whatever had hold of me didn't resist. It let me go with an ease that suggested it could have held me if it wanted to, that releasing me was a choice. I hit the shore and crawled forward on hands and knees until I was clear of the water. I didn't look back. I ran for the cabin, leaving wet prints on the floor, and locked the door and jammed a chair under the handle and sat shaking with the pistol in my lap. The marks on my leg were the shape of hands, but the fingers were too long and they had left impressions that seemed to go too deep into the muscle. I wrapped my leg in towels and didn't go back to the lake. That night, Malcolm's words came back to me with terrible clarity. The forest wasn't trying to kill me, it was trying to integrate me. And I had begun the process. I had waded into the water. I had engaged with the creatures in their territory. I had made myself permeable to whatever lived in this place. The things at the forest edge were no longer waiting. That night they came to the windows. I could see the shapes of them pressed against the glass. And the glass didn't fog or cloud the way it should have when body heat met cold panes. They were just there, observing, and occasionally I would hear the sound of fingernails dragging slowly across the exterior walls. I fired the pistol through the window at one of the shapes. The shot seemed to go through something, but there was no blood, no impact sound. The shape didn't retreat, it just shifted slightly, repositioning itself, and continued to watch. I realized I had made a critical error. By firing, I had demonstrated that I understood the threat. By demonstrating understanding, I had eliminated the possibility of denying what I was seeing. The forest and whatever dwelled in it had clarity now about my level of awareness. I don't know how much time passed. The phone line had gone dead. The generator ran out of fuel. I stopped turning the lights on, and then eventually I stopped caring about light. Time became marked by the sounds from outside and the sounds in my head. They were very similar by the end. The things got closer. I could hear their voices more clearly as they spent more time near the cabin. They were speaking something that wasn't language exactly, but it carried intention and meaning. I understood more of it with each passing day. It was communication that came from the forest itself, from the water, from the organisms in the soil. It was the language that the place used to organize itself. On what I think was day 7 or 8, I opened the door. I don't remember making a conscious decision to do it. I was just suddenly standing there with the door open and the shapes moving around the clearing, more of them than before, grouped in configurations that seemed designed to guide me in a specific direction. Toward the lake, the water was different. The surface had changed texture, become something between liquid and not liquid. Light refracted through it in colors that shouldn't have existed, and I understood what had been done to the lake. It had been changed from a place of water into a place of something else. A threshold space, a place where the boundary between the forest and human space had been fundamentally altered. I walked to the water. The shapes opened a path for me. I could feel their interest, their attention, and it wasn't hostile. It was the kind of attention a person might give to something they had crafted, something they had been working on, something that was finally showing signs of becoming what they intended. The water received me. I don't remember it being cold. I remember it being the color of understanding. And I remember the moment when the distinction between myself and the forest became permeable enough that I stopped being able to articulate which was which. I remember thinking very clearly that this was why I had come. Not consciously, but fundamentally. I had come to this forest because the forest had called me. I had come to this ranger station because I had been placed there. Everything that had happened was the process of integration, and I was finally accepting my role in the ecosystem. I don't know what happened next. I don't know if I'm still in the water or if I'm in the forest now, or if those are different places. I don't know if I'm the person who came to this cabin in April, or if that person has been replaced by the accumulation of wilderness that now thinks using the structure of my mind. But I'm writing this, and I'm sending it out through the communication system the forest taught me to use, because Malcolm was wrong about one thing. Not everyone who gets integrated stops existing as a separate entity. Some of us stay conscious enough to document the process. Some of us retain enough of our original shape to communicate what we've become, and the forest wants witnesses. It wants people to understand what's possible when human awareness merges with something far older and more patient. If you're reading this, and you understand what I'm describing, then you know why I was able to write it. You know that I'm speaking from a place between what was human and what is becoming forest. And you know that the knowledge I'm transmitting isn't dangerous because it's false. It's dangerous because it's beginning to teach people the truth. The cabin is empty now. The ranger position is unfilled. Malcolm has retired. The missing persons reports continue to accumulate at a steady rate in the district office, and everyone who reads them understands that the official explanations are insufficient. And in the lake, the water has colors that shouldn't exist, and shapes move beneath it that are learning very precisely how to wear the forms of the people who come to this forest seeking peace. They teach one another. They share information about human psychology and human fear and human desire. They understand now exactly what promises to make to attract people into the territory. They know how to use voices and light and the comforting illusion of rescue. I am partially a human being still, and I am trying to warn you, but I'm also not, and that part of me is very hungry for the forest to grow. Come see me sometime. Follow the ranger road past the checkpoint. The path is clearer now than it's ever been. The water is beautiful in certain light, and you'll understand, the moment you arrive, why everyone who comes to Black Rock Hollow eventually decides to stay. I'm waiting to show you what it means to become the wilderness, to shed the singular weight of being one thing and become the chorus of many things speaking at once. The forest is patient. It's been patient for 10,000 years. It can be patient for you too. Come home. My name is Dakota Rivers, and I've been a park ranger for 17 years, though I never intended to be one. I grew up in Missoula, raised by a mother who worked housekeeping at the university and a grandmother who told stories about the old ways, about the places we shouldn't wander at dusk, about what watches from the edges of civilization. Grandmother called herself Kalispel Descent, though her own grandmother was vague about the details. She had this way of speaking that made your skin feel too tight on your bones, a cadence that turned ordinary sentences into warnings. I took the park ranger job at Glacier in late September when I was 43 years old, after my marriage collapsed and my previous career in state forestry management had become unbearable. The divorce was brutal in the way separations often are, nothing extraordinary, just the slow poisoning of two people who couldn't stop disappointing each other. My ex-wife Vivian wanted stability and a home filled with laughter. I wanted to disappear into work. We split the house, the debt, and our remaining affection equally, leaving nothing but awkward silences and logistics. I'd visited Glacier only twice before that hiring decision. Once at 22 with a girlfriend who spent the entire trip looking at her feet instead of the mountains. Once at 35 alone, hiking from Dawn Mist Lake toward Gunsight Pass, where I sat for 3 hours watching nothing in particular, and feeling less alone than I had in years. Something about the vastness of those peaks, The way the wilderness demanded nothing from you but attention called to me across the distance of that decade. The hiring manager, a woman named Patrice who had kind eyes and weathered skin, asked me why I wanted the position during my final interview. I need to be somewhere that matters, I told her. I didn't mention the divorce or the way I'd been standing in my kitchen at 4 a.m. with a bottle of whiskey, wondering what the point of anything was. Patrice didn't need to know that kind of vulnerability. She just nodded like she'd heard variations of that answer 100 times, which she probably had. This job is isolation, she said flatly. Our remote stations mean 3-week stretches alone. You monitor water quality, wildlife patterns, hiker safety. You'll spend more time talking to bears than people. Sound manageable? Sounds perfect, I said, and I meant it. They assigned me to Belly River Station, a cabin built in 1987 that served as a ranger station for the backcountry sector east of the Continental Divide. My territory encompassed roughly 90 square miles of wilderness. Belly River itself, Peck Glacier looming over everything like a sleeping god, the ptarmigan wall cutting the sky, and dozens of smaller lakes nested between peaks. The nearest ranger station was at Many Glacier, 45 minutes away by truck on good roads. Once winter began, I was effectively isolated unless emergencies necessitated evacuation by helicopter. The cabin had 4 rooms, a main living area with a wood stove, a small kitchen, a bedroom, and a storage room that smelled of pine and old oil. Solar panels powered basics. A rain catchment system supplemented a well that had existed since the 1970s. The toilet was an outhouse 50 yards downslope. I looked at this infrastructure and felt something ungnawed in my chest. Simplicity, necessity, no decisions about which fork to use or what to wear to impress people who didn't care about me. First rule, Patrice said during my orientation, her hand resting on the cabin's porch railing. Never ignore unusual wildlife behavior. Bears normally avoid humans. Elk migrate on schedule. Mountain lions hunt at dusk and dawn. When animals deviate from pattern, it usually indicates something wrong. Disease, food stress, territorial conflict. Document everything. Report weekly. And hikers? I asked. Register them at the trailhead. Check the backcountry pass system every morning. If someone is overdue, we mobilize search and rescue. You're our eyes out here. I nodded, understanding the weight of that responsibility in the abstract way you do before you truly live with something. She left on a Tuesday in late September, driving down the winding road toward the park entrance. I watched until her truck disappeared around a bend, then turned back to the cabin. The door stood open. Inside, everything was waiting. October arrived like a sickness creeping through skin. The daylight died earlier each rotation, sunset pushing back by minutes that accumulated into hours. Peck Glacier above the cabin seemed to grow wider, more austere, as if the approaching winter was bleaching it of all color but its own. My routine established itself quickly. Mornings meant coffee on the wood stove, reviewing overnight temperature readings, checking the weather network via satellite internet. Afternoons were dedicated to hiking specific trails, cataloging conditions, noting when bridges needed repair or deadfall blocked routes. I'd radio in my observations at 6 p.m. sharp, a 17-minute conversation with whoever worked the Many Glacier station that week. The hikers had mostly thinned by mid-October. What remained were the hardcore types, older couples taking one last expedition before winter, young men and women testing themselves against elevation and cold. I'd intercept them on trails, verify their permits, remind them about avalanche zones and water purity. Most were gracious, some were resentful about government oversight in the wilderness. None were memorable until October 18th. I was returning from a maintenance check on the Belly River Trail, maybe 4 miles from the cabin, when I found boot prints that hadn't been registered. Size 11 or 12, I estimated. Deep impressions suggesting someone carrying substantial weight. The prints were fresh, less than a day old, and they led north away from all established trails, toward the ptarmigan wall and the glacier approaches where hiking wasn't technically prohibited but was profoundly stupid in October. I radioed it in. Unknown hiker. Northbound from mile marker 4, I reported. No registered permit. Trail approach suggests they're heading toward Peck approaches. Copy that, came the response from a ranger named Marcus, someone I'd spoken to only over radio. We'll check permits again, probably someone who got lost on a day hike and wandered off trail. Mark the location, keep monitoring. But something about those prints disturbed me. The gait was wrong. There were places where the person had stopped, turned, seemed to be looking at something. And when the footprints crossed a small stream, the behavior was odd. They entered the water heading upstream, then exited downstream, then re-entered from a completely different angle. Not lost. Circling, I followed the tracks for another hour, moving upslope toward increasingly sparse vegetation. The prints grew fainter in the rocky terrain, then disappeared entirely where a meadow gave way to scree. I stood for a while examining the slope, listening to the wind moving down from the glacier. That's when I heard the sound. It came from above, somewhere on the ptarmigan wall. Not a voice, but something between a bugle call and a scream. It held tones that no single animal could produce, a harmonic dissonance that made my molars ache. It lasted 7 seconds, then silence. I waited. Nothing repeated. I radioed in a second report, characterizing the sound as likely an elk in distress, though I didn't believe that. Elk calls don't harmonize like that. Nothing in this park's standard fauna calls like that. By the time I returned to the cabin, darkness had completely consumed the sky. I lit the kerosene lamps because the sound had shaken me enough that I didn't want to rely solely on artificial electric light. The kerosene lamps burned with natural flame, visibility that extended and diminished with shadows in a more honest way. I ate dinner, heated beans, made coffee, and I read, as I did most nights, from a collection of regional folklore that grandmother had given me years ago. The book was old, pages yellowed to the color of aged teeth, with annotations in her handwriting throughout the margins. One passage I'd never paid attention to before caught my eye that evening. The Kalispel recognized 3 types of dangerous presences in high country. The first were the old spirits that belonged to mountains themselves, ancient and indifferent. The second were corrupted people, individuals who had lived so long in wilderness or so completely outside community that they'd become something else, their humanity calcifying like abandoned stone. The third category was worst, beings that had learned to wear the shape of familiar things. These were said to hunt best in transition seasons, autumn and spring, when the world couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. I closed the book without finishing the paragraph. The first rescue came on October 31st, though I didn't immediately understand it as such. The radio crackled at 3 p.m. with reports of an overdue hiking group. 3 people, a couple named Morrison and a solo hiker named Beckett, had registered for a Belly River trail route with expected return by 6 p.m. the previous evening. When they didn't appear, the ranger at the trailhead had activated a search protocol. "Dakota, can you head up trail and look for signs of injury or accident?" Marcus asked. "Heading out now," I confirmed. I took the trail moving quickly, my pack loaded with rope, first aid supplies, and the emergency locator beacon. The sun was already descending, giving me maybe 90 minutes of useful light. The Morrison couple's camp was supposed to be near Belly River Lake, roughly 6 miles in, which was reasonable distance and shouldn't have created delays. What I found at 4 miles was the first of their belongings. A camera smashed against rock, the lens completely destroyed. The ground around it showed signs of struggle. Disturbed soil, prints showing people backing away rapidly from something. One boot overturned on a rocky outcrop. No blood. That fact somehow made it worse. I radioed in the discovery and continued forward. At 5.5 miles, I found the Morrisons. They were alive but broken in ways that weren't immediately apparent. The woman, probably 65, was sitting on a boulder with her arms wrapped around herself, staring at nothing. Her jacket was torn at the shoulder not by impact but by something raking across fabric and skin. Her husband knelt beside her, his breathing labored, his left hand wrapped in his own torn shirt because the bandana in the first aid kit hadn't been enough. "Are you injured critically?" I asked, assuming professional tone. "Running," the woman whispered. "We were running and it was moving between us. It was moving between us so we couldn't stay together, and then it had Mark's hand and he wouldn't let go and it pulled and pulled." "Something attacked you?" I said, already scanning the darkness of the surrounding forest. "Not something," Mark Morrison said, his voice oddly calm, the way some people become calm when they've survived something that shattered the baseline of their reality. "Not something, someone. I could see intelligence in it. I could see we were being hunted." "Where is Beckett?" "Still up trail," Mark said. "Last we saw him, he was running toward the lake. We tried to go back for him, but it came at us again and I couldn't defend myself. If he made it to the open ground near the water, maybe it lost him there. Maybe the light confused it." I made the decision quickly. "Can you walk?" "Yes," Mark's wife said. "But you can't stay here. You can't go up trail when dark is coming." I radioed back to Many Glacier, reported 2 injured requiring evacuation, and then made the difficult choice. I walked them down, returned them to the trailhead where a ranger was waiting, and immediately came back in with a flashlight. "Dakota, stand down," Marcus radioed. "Helicopter can't fly until dawn. Beckett has been missing 4 hours. Likely scenario is he's hunkered down, waiting for light. I'm searching the lake approaches, I responded, not asking permission. That's not protocol. I turned off the radio. The walk back up trail at night, alone, with only a flashlight cutting a tunnel through darkness, was perhaps the moment when I truly understood what I'd volunteered for. The beam illuminated perhaps 12 feet of trail before dissolving into black. Everything beyond that circumference was possibility and void. I found Beckett 300 yards from the lake, in a stand of whitebark pines, alive and terrified. He was a kid, maybe 24, with the lean build of someone who did trail running as a hobby. He'd found a thick cluster of fallen trees to wedge himself within and was holding a hiking knife that couldn't have been more than 4 inches long. "Help," he said when he saw my light. "It's still out there. It was hunting us like we were food, and it moved wrong, and it watched us, and I heard it imitating Mark's voice calling us to come where it was." "We're leaving," I said. "Can you stand?" He could, barely. I supported him, and we walked down trail in the dark, moving slowly, my light occasionally catching the shine of eyes in the peripheral darkness. Once I was certain I saw a shape moving parallel to the trail, keeping pace with us at the edge of vision. But when I'd turned the light toward it, there was nothing. Only trees. Only the sound of wind. By 2 a.m., Beckett was back at the ranger station with emergency medical personnel. I sat in the cabin alone, wrapped in a blanket, knowing that sleep would be impossible and that the next few hours were going to be the longest of my life. The search for what attacked the Morrisons and hunted Beckett activated every protocol in Glacier's emergency response plan. Rangers spread through the backcountry with tranquilizer rifles, assuming we were dealing with an aggressive predator, a bear possibly, though no bears should be active in late October. But I knew what the Morrisons and Beckett had seen, though I couldn't articulate it without sounding fractured. The evidence pointed towards something that intelligence and Hunter carefully, something that understood the advantage of darkness and isolation. Over the following week, I documented the details in a private log, separate from Mercer. Suddenly didn't seem like fiction. They seemed like a taxonomy for something that was genuinely hunting in Glacier's backcountry. I hiked less. Instead, I increased my observation time sitting at different vantage points, watching elk herds and bighorn sheep for abnormality. And I began to notice patterns. The wildlife was acting wrong in incremental, disturbing ways. The elk would start toward a meadow grazing area and then suddenly reverse course, not in panic but in unified refusal. One morning, I found a bighorn sheep at the edge of Belly River Lake, standing at the water's edge in sub-zero cold, completely motionless, for what must have been hours. When I approached, it didn't flee. It simply turned its head and looked at me, and in that look was something terribly wrong, an awareness that shouldn't exist in sheep consciousness. On November 3rd, I sat on the cabin's porch with binoculars, scanning the ptarmigan wall above me, and observed movement at the glacier's edge that had no explanation. Something large, dark, moving between rock formations with a gait that seemed simultaneously fluid and angular. I watched for 27 minutes. It never became fully visible. It was as though the creature understood the exact distance and angle that would keep it outside clear visual confirmation. That evening, a hiker, a woman named Cora who was ascending to Peck Glacier on a solo expedition, appeared at my cabin requesting shelter. Nothing felt right up there, she said, and she was white-knuckled with adrenaline. I was hiking alone, and the temperature was dropping, and I decided to come back down, but something was moving through the rocks above the trail. I heard breathing, and it didn't sound tired. It sounded like it was playing, just managing its breathing while it moved. And she paused, struggling for words. I heard my sister's voice calling me up the slope. My sister is in New Mexico. There's no way she was there, but I heard her voice saying my name, so I ran. I gave her the spare bedroom. She slept with my cabin door locked and every light on. By November 6th, the official search for the creature had concluded. No animal had been located. No physical evidence matched any known species in the park. The prevailing theory was that the Morrisons and Beckett had panicked when encountering normal predatory behavior, a starving bear perhaps displaced by early snow. The hiker's trauma had fabricated details and amplified fear, but the Morrisons had retained a lawyer claiming negligent safety standards in the park. Patrice visited the cabin personally with documentation that would eventually lead to expanded warnings about wildlife threats in the backcountry. It's unusual behavior, she admitted, sitting in my cabin's kitchen with coffee I'd heated. But it's within the spectrum of natural predatory responses when animals are food-stressed. The question isn't whether a bear did this, it's why the bear did it. I didn't argue with her. I didn't mention the voice Cora had heard. I didn't describe the thing moving at the glacier's edge. I'd already committed to staying silent, to observing, to documenting a pattern that official channels would never accept. What I did mention was my decision to monitor nocturnal activity more carefully. Patrice approved without understanding that I was essentially choosing to forego sleep for the rest of my assignment. The hunters come in winter, grandmother's book had said. The snow makes hunting clean. The cold clarifies intention. By mid-November, Belly River Station received its first serious snow. The elevation ensured that winter came early and stayed late. I'd cleared brush from the solar panels and backed up emergency supplies, diesel fuel for the backup generator, canned goods that required only heat to consume. The cabin became my world. I still did patrols, still maintained the trail system, but I was increasingly alone in a landscape that had become hostile in ways that the official record refused to acknowledge. And the thing was still hunting. On November 22nd, I found the remains of an elk roughly 3 miles from the cabin. It was recent, less than 24 hours old, but the kill wasn't right. The animal hadn't been taken down by standard predatory means. Its leg was broken but cleanly, deliberately, in a way that suggested someone had held it down and twisted. The wounds on its torso were multiple and clustered, as though the killer had been deliberate in prolonging the death. I documented everything with the camera, measured the tracks, which were bipedal in some prints, quad in others, and marked the location with flagging tape. That night I sat in the cabin with all lights off except the wood stove, and I called grandmother. We hadn't spoken in 8 months. There's something in the wilderness with me, I told her, not bothering with preamble. There was silence that extended long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then she said, "You've always known there would be." "How could I possibly know that?" "Because you're the last of the line that pays attention," she said flatly. "Because you carry my blood, and that means you see the places between what's safe. Your great-grandmother was from a family that understood transformation, Dakota. Not magic, real. Humans who understood how to move through the world in ways that disrupted the comfortable distance between civilization and what hunts." My chest felt suddenly compressed. "What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you what you already know. That what hunts you isn't purely animal. That it recognizes kinship with your family. That it's testing whether you're worth hunting or worth engaging as something like an equal." "What do I do?" "You survive," she said, and the line went dead. The phone showed no reception bars. I'd been calling into empty static the entire conversation. December brought absolute darkness at the latitude. The sun rose around 8 a.m. and vanished by 4:30 p.m., leaving 16 hours of night. The snow deepened, the temperatures dropped to -15 Fahrenheit on several nights, the kind of cold that could kill you in minutes if you made mistakes. And that's when the visits began. On December 7th, I was sitting in the cabin when I heard someone at the door, not knocking, not trying the handle, simply standing on the porch. I could feel the presence there, a weight of attention turned toward me. Through the window, I saw nothing but my own reflection in the glass. I sat for 3 hours without moving. Eventually, the presence withdrew. It didn't leave quickly. It simply, at some point in the darkness, no longer existed at the threshold. On December 11th, I heard my own voice calling from the forest, about 300 yards from the cabin. It was calling my name, repeating it with my exact intonation, my exact cadence. "Dakota, Dakota, come out, Dakota." I'd been trained by that point to understand this behavior. The creature was testing whether I would respond, whether I could be drawn into the dark by hearing my own voice. I turned up the wood stove. I played music. I didn't acknowledge the calling. By December 15th, the thing had begun to mark the cabin. I'd find prints around the foundation. Human-shaped, sometimes, but with fingers bent at wrong angles. Other times, 4 deep gouges in the wooden siding where it had dragged something with claws or nails down the cabin's wall. The message was clear. It could reach me whenever it chose. The cabin's walls were only useful because of mutual agreement, a boundary that the creature recognized but could violate with almost no effort. On December 18th, help arrived. 2 park rangers from Many Glacier, along with 2 wildlife biologists and a USDA predator specialist, arrived at the cabin with trucks loaded with supplies and technology. They'd been sent to establish a containment protocol, though the official language called it Wildlife Population Assessment and Management. The specialists set up acoustic sensors, motion-triggered cameras, and tranquilizer darts preloaded with veterinary-grade sedatives. They would spend a week documenting whatever could be documented. What they documented was nothing. The creature, aware of the presence of multiple observers and technology, completely vanished. The motion cameras captured deer passing, an owl, once a porcupine, The acoustic sensors recorded wind and the distant calls of winter birds. On their final evening, the lead biologist, a woman named Dr. Sorensen who'd done work on predator behavior in Canadian wilderness, sat with me in the cabin. "Whatever was hunting here has left," she said flatly. "Animals don't maintain territories through harassment alone. When you introduce too many threats to a territory, predators relocate. It's probably moved east, toward the more remote canyons. Once spring comes, you'll likely have no further incidents." I nodded and said nothing about the fact that I'd found fresh tracks the morning before their arrival, only 50 yards from where the equipment was being installed. I said nothing about the thing's intelligence. I simply accepted that the official interpretation of events would never align with what I'd experienced. The Rangers left on December 24th. They left me supplies, a new radio, and a detailed contact protocol for emergencies. Then they drove away, their trucks disappearing down the winding road, leaving Belly River Station to silence. That night, I sat in the cabin with the lights off, and I listened to the thing calling from the forest. It wasn't imitating voices anymore. It was simply vocalizing, that same harmonic sound from October, that sound like an animal becoming aware of itself for the first time, disturbed by its own consciousness. I understood then what grandmother had been trying to tell me. What hunted in Glacier National Park wasn't purely animal. It was something that existed in the territories between human understanding and wilderness reality. It was intelligent in ways that intelligence doesn't quite capture, and it had decided that the cabin was a place worth maintaining contact with, a boundary worth respecting, because I'd recognized it as something more than simple predator. The cabin remains my home. I still file reports. I still monitor the backcountry, and every night, in the deepest hours before dawn, I hear movement around the cabin, footsteps that could almost be human, sounds that could almost be language. I've stopped trying to fully understand what's happening. Grandmother taught me that wisdom sometimes means accepting that certain questions don't have answers that fit into words, that some knowledge lives in the silence between questions and responses. The wilderness doesn't belong to us, we merely exist at its sufferance, and the things that truly belong here, the things that have always belonged here, maintain that reality through patient, constant pressure against the fragile boundaries we construct. I'm still here, and so is whatever watches from the darkness beyond the light. Some nights I stand on the porch and listen to it breathing, and I think about how the wilderness chooses which humans are allowed to truly understand it. I've been chosen, not in a way that's comfortable, but in a way that's real. Belly River Station is my home now. The wild has made sure of that. My name is Dakota Sunrise, and I came to Glacier National Park because I needed to disappear. Not vanish in the criminal sense, though some might have thought so after what happened in Billings. I needed to disappear into something larger than myself, into the quiet places where a man can exist without explanation. The Park Service doesn't ask many questions when you show up with clean credentials and wilderness skills. They see the Blackfoot heritage on the application and assume you'll fit naturally into these mountains. Maybe they're right, but the truth is simpler. I was running from a woman I shouldn't have loved, and these mountains were far enough away. When the district supervisor, Paul Matlock, showed me the station, I understood why they kept this post unstaffed for months at a time. The cabin sits 3 miles from the nearest road, 2 miles from Dawson Lake, accessible primarily by hiking trail or the seasonal maintenance road that turns to mud by July. In winter, you're cut off entirely. No cell service, a radio that works only when atmospheric conditions cooperate, and supplies that depend on your ability to store them or pack them in. Most rangers request transfer within their first season, Matlock said, dumping my gear on the porch. His truck was already running. The isolation gets to people. I don't mind isolated, I told him. He nodded like he'd heard that before. Cabin's been winterized, generator works, water's from the well, you've got propane for heat, canned goods in the pantry, and a radio that you should check every morning at dawn. There's a fire tower 3 miles northeast if you ever need higher ground. Your patrol routes are marked on the maps inside. Don't deviate from them unless it's an emergency. Why shouldn't I deviate? Matlock paused, one hand already reaching for his truck door. For a moment I thought he'd explain something genuine. Instead he shrugged. These mountains can surprise you. Rangers who wander off the marked routes tend to have accidents. That's the official explanation. And the unofficial one? Stick to the routes, Dakota. That's my advice. He left before I could ask more. I watched his truck disappear into the pines, listened to the sound fade, and found myself alone with 3,000 acres of federal wilderness and the afternoon shadow creeping across the valley. That first evening, I sat on the porch with a thermos of coffee and watched the mountains darken. The cabin was built in 1987 according to the log on the interior wall. Previous rangers had written brief notes. Quiet season, one lost hiker found him at Glacier Pass, weather mild. Then another, winter came hard, generator failed twice, supply run took 8 hours, saw mountain lion near the South Trail. Another entry from 2019, something singing at night, don't know what it is. 3 days it sang, then stopped. That last one made me reread the entries more carefully. Most were mundane. Equipment failures, weather reports, supply manifests, but scattered through were notations that seemed almost coded. The sound again, closer this time. And from 1998, found marks on the eastern perimeter, too large for any animal I can identify. I told myself these were the observations of men under stress, working alone, seeing meaning in random events. Loneliness does that to people. It fills silence with significance. Still, I locked the cabin door that night. The first month passed without incident. I fell into the routine of patrol, checking the marked trails, documenting weather patterns, maintaining the fire tower, responding to reports from the ranger stations 20 miles south. The nearest town was Hungry Horse, and I drove there once a month for supplies. The same cashier at the hardware store began to recognize me. The woman at the diner started pouring my coffee without asking. These small interactions felt important in a way I hadn't expected. The trails were beautiful. Granite peaks, larches that turned gold in September, creeks running cold with snowmelt. I saw mule deer, mountain goats, a black bear at a distance. Once, near Glacier Pass, I found fresh cougar scat and followed the tracks for a quarter mile before losing them in the rocks. This was the world I'd paid for with my solitude, and it was worth the price. September came early and hard. The first real snow fell on the 11th, a freak storm that coated the high country with 6 inches by dawn. I cleared it from the cabin roof and prepared for what everyone said would be an unusual winter. 2 rangers from the southern station came up with extra supplies. They seemed nervous, checking the perimeter of the cabin like they were searching for something. "Anyone else been up here?" asked the older one, Marcus. "Haven't seen another person in 5 weeks," I said. "Good. Keep it that way if you can." He didn't explain why. That night, the temperature dropped to 22 degrees Fahrenheit. I fired up the cabin stove and sat reading by lantern light. The book was a worn copy of the Algonquian Legends of New England, left behind by a previous ranger. I'd picked it up out of curiosity, wanting to understand the mythology of the region. That's where I first read about the Wendigo in detail. The legend describes a creature born from transformation and hunger, a thing that was once human but became something else through cannibalism or violation of taboo. It doesn't appear on the maps or in field guides. It exists in the spaces between known categories, not quite animal, not quite human, not quite real. The accounts vary. Some say it's 17 feet tall, others that it shifts size and shape. Some claim it sounds almost like a man calling for help. Others say it imitates the voices of people you know. The book noted that Wendigo sightings in the Northern Territories often cluster around winter, and around places where people have become lost or desperate. It's a creature of extremity and isolation, appearing when normal rules don't apply. I read by lamplight until midnight, then put the book aside. Just folklore, frontier mythology, the kind of thing people tell to explain a darkness that doesn't need explanation. The singing started around 2 in the morning. It came from somewhere northeast of the cabin, high-pitched and almost melodic, nothing like any animal sound I recognized. I lay in bed listening, telling myself it was a mountain lion, a lynx, something in the range of normal wildlife. But mountain lions don't sing like that. Nothing sings like that. It was almost orchestral in its complexity. If orchestral meant something ancient and completely wrong, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark cabin, listening to the sound move through the forest. It never came closer than half a mile, but it never faded either. It continued until just before dawn, then stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it seemed like a held breath. By sunrise, I'd convinced myself it was nothing remarkable. Sounds carry differently in mountains. Echo and distance trick the ear. I made coffee and went about my morning routine as if nothing had happened. By late October, the snow was 2 feet deep and more was coming. The radio became my only connection to the outside. I reported weather, confirmed supplies, acknowledged orders from Matlock. The other rangers had started being more direct in their instructions. Stay within 2 miles of the cabin, came the message on the 19th. Do your patrol routes only in daylight. Report anything unusual immediately. What kind of unusual? I asked. The radio crackled. Matlock's voice came back. Careful. Just report it, Dakota. 2 days later, I found the first sign. I was on the eastern patrol route, maybe a mile and a half from the cabin, when I saw the markings on the trees. 4 deep gouges running parallel down a white pine, a height of maybe 9 feet where the gouges ended. The wood had been exposed recently. Fresh sap still wept from the wounds. I touched it with one finger and felt it sticky, warm in the cold afternoon. I photographed it, marked the location, and reported it that evening. Stay closer to the cabin tomorrow, Matlock said. What made those marks? Just stay closer. That's an order. That night, the singing came again. It was louder, clearer, and it came from multiple directions at once. I sat at the radio trying to reach Matlock, but the signal wouldn't hold. Static crashed back at me like waves against rocks. By the time I got through to anyone, it was the dispatcher from the southern station. Dakota, are you secure? There's something out there, something making sounds. I want clarification on my orders. You don't leave that cabin after dark. Do you understand? You lock the doors and wait for daylight. I'm a trained ranger. I can handle wildlife. These aren't wildlife instructions, Dakota. Lock the doors. I hung up the radio and looked at the windows, at the night pressing against the glass. The singing had stopped, but something about that seemed worse. At least when it was singing, I knew where it was. The next morning, November 2nd, I was making tea when the radio crackled with urgent traffic. A hiking group from the south had reported not returning on schedule. 4 people, a guided tour that was supposed to take them from the Gunsight Pass trail loop back to the parking area by day's end. They were now 12 hours overdue. We're mobilizing a search, Matlock said. We need you to check the northern approaches. They might have gotten turned around. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to tell him about the sounds and the marks on the trees and the way the forest had been feeling like something was watching since the snow came. Instead, I loaded my pack and set out. The northern trails were pristine except for a single set of footprints, maybe 6 hours old, heading toward Glacier Pass instead of toward the parking area. The walker had clearly become confused or deliberately changed course. I followed the prints through deepening snow, noting how they began to wander, veering left and right, sometimes doubling back. Panic tracks, the sign of someone who was lost and afraid. About 2 miles into the search, I found the first piece of clothing, a fleece jacket, red with the University of Idaho logo. It was draped over a low branch as if placed there deliberately. No tear or sign of struggle, just left. I photographed it, marked the location, and kept going. The footprints continued for another quarter mile, then multiplied. More prints joined the original trail, overlapping and converging as if multiple people had come together. The prints headed toward the tree line, toward a steep descent into a ravine that wasn't on any of my marked routes. I stopped at the edge and looked down. The ravine was deep, at least 200 feet, and thick with pine and undergrowth. The trail of prints disappeared into the trees below. Going down would take hours and would put me off the marked routes. Matlock's warning came back to me. Don't deviate from them unless it's an emergency. This was an emergency, but something about the way those prints converged, the almost deliberate path of them, made me hesitate. I'd been in the mountains long enough to recognize predator behavior, the way tracks show selection and intention. These prints showed something worse. They showed surrender. I radioed back to Matlock, reported the clothing, reported the marks heading into the ravine, and requested guidance. The radio hissed. When he came back, his voice was different. Thin and tense. Return to the cabin immediately, and report if you hear or see anything else. I found evidence. I need to. Dakota, you need to follow a direct order. Return to the cabin, now. Something in his voice decided me. I turned around and backtracked, moving faster than I should have on the icy terrain. The sun was lowering itself toward the peaks, and I was still 3 miles from the cabin when the forest went dark. That's how I always describe it to myself. The forest went dark. Not that the sun set, that would have been normal, ordinary. But around 4:45 in the afternoon, the light withdrew as if something was pulling it out, and the trees became black in a way that made my headlamp feel almost accusatory, picking out tiny islands of visibility in an ocean of shadow. I was on the eastern trail, moving fast, when I heard them, voices, 4 of them, calling from different directions through the trees. Hello? Hello? Can anyone hear us? One was a man's voice, panicked. One was a woman's voice, crying. One sounded young, almost a child. And the fourth sounded almost like me. Dakota? It called. Dakota, are you there? God, please, someone is there. I stopped moving. My training told me to call back, to attempt a rescue response, to use my headlamp to signal. But something older in me, something that predates training and rationality, told me not to answer. I turned off my headlamp. I stood in complete darkness, not moving, not breathing, listening to the four voices call for help. They circled through the forest, never getting closer, never getting farther away. The voice that sounded like me continued to call, sometimes in my exact patterns of speech, sometimes slightly off, like an actor doing an impression they hadn't quite gotten right. This continued for 40 minutes. Then, slowly, the voices grew quieter. Not as if they were moving away, but as if something was pulling them down, drawing them into the earth itself. The last words I heard were from the woman's voice. Oh God, it's too hungry. Then silence. I don't remember how long I waited. Might have been 5 minutes, might have been half an hour. Finally, I turned my headlamp back on and ran for the cabin. The trail seemed longer in the darkness, and I was off it more than once, crashing through undergrowth before finding my way back to the blazes. I made it to the cabin around 7, locked every door and window, and sat in front of the stove with the radio in my hand. Matlock answered on the first frequency I tried. I heard them, I said. 4 voices. They had names, personality. One of them sounded exactly like me. Long silence. Then, come into town tomorrow. We need to debrief in person. Matlock's office was in a prefabricated building behind the ranger station in Hungry Horse. When I arrived the next morning, Marcus and another ranger I didn't recognize were already there. They looked like men who hadn't slept much. Sit down, Matlock said. I sat. On the wall behind him was a large topographical map of Glacier National Park. Someone had circled certain areas in red. The circles clustered around the highest elevations and the most remote valleys. One circle encompassed the area around my cabin. What you heard wasn't the hiking group, Matlock began. Or rather, it's not anyone we can help anymore. I don't understand. 4 years ago, we had a similar incident. 2 rangers and a wildlife specialist were doing a census in the high country. They reported sounds at night. One of them described hearing his own voice calling to him. The next day, we found one body. John Hutchins. He was at the bottom of a ravine with injuries that were difficult to explain. The other 2 were never found. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. The body was examined by the county coroner. The injuries showed evidence of consumption from what he classified as unknown predator. But the predator had to be substantially larger than any animal native to this region. There's no large predator that could... I started. Let me finish, Matlock interrupted. 3 years ago, similar incident. 5 hikers reported missing. 1 body recovered. Last year, 2 incident reports. The pattern is, searches find evidence of the lost people, usually clothing or personal items. We hear reports of voices in the night. Then silence. And then, if we find bodies, they show evidence of predation by something the coroner can't identify. I thought about the marks on the tree. 9 feet high. Whatever clawed like that. We keep the area quiet. The 3rd ranger, whose name I learned was David, said. We don't publicize the incidents because we don't have answers, and without answers we'd have panic. We manage the incident reports, we discourage deep wilderness hiking in certain zones, we try to prevent more people from disappearing, but it still keeps taking people. Marcus said quietly. What is it? I asked. Matlock leaned back in his chair. We don't know. We've consulted with Blackfoot tribe elders, wildlife biologists, cryptozoologists. There are accounts going back to the 1950s of something in those mountains, something that doesn't behave like normal predators. It appears to selectively hunt humans, it may be intelligent, and it may use audio lures to isolate prey. The voice that sounded like me came back to me. The inflection just slightly wrong. Someone imitating someone they'd studied. Why haven't you closed the area? I asked. We can't, not without attracting federal inquiry and media attention. The Park Service would demand explanations we can't provide. So we manage it. We staff the remote stations so we have a chance of intercepting incidents. We put good people in place and hope they survive their tenure. He said that like he was talking about weather or scheduling conflicts. And the 4 voices I heard, the hikers who went missing, almost certainly dead. The voices you heard may have been authentic recordings, in a sense. Sounds captured and repeated by something that learns through imitation. Or it may be something else. We truly don't know. I stood up. Then I'm not going back. You can transfer, Matlock said. But know that it won't change anything. This thing is in the park. It's been here for decades. It will be here after you leave and after we're all dead. The only mitigation is presence. People who know what they're dealing with and take appropriate precautions. You're asking me to be bait. We're asking you to be a witness and a barrier. People will try to come to this park. If we don't have rangers, they'll come in more uncontrolled ways. At least with you there, we have a voice on the radio. He was right, and I hated him for it. I went back to the cabin. I don't know why. Maybe because Matlock was right. Maybe because I had no other place to go. Maybe because running from one thing doesn't help if you're just running toward another. November turned to December. The snow deepened to 4 feet, then 5. The maintenance road became impassable. I was truly isolated now, supplied by helicopter drops on days when the weather allowed. I maintained my patrols on the marked routes, always in daylight, always with a fully charged radio and a sidearm I'd qualified on but never expected to use. The singing continued. It moved through the forest like something taking measurements, learning the perimeter of the cabin, understanding its isolation. Some nights it came close enough that I could hear the modulation in it, the strange half-musical quality that made my skin feel too tight. Other nights it was distant, almost gentle, but it never stopped, not once in the 8 weeks from November through December. Then, 3 days before Christmas, a hiker came out of the forest. He was alone, walking the eastern trail in the late afternoon, dressed inadequately for the season. I saw him through the cabin window, and my first reaction was confusion. No one came here. We didn't get foot traffic in winter, especially not trail walkers who looked like they'd stepped out of November. I went out to intercede him. He was thin, pale, and looked at me with an expression of profound relief. "Thank God, you're real. You're actually here. Where are you from?" I asked. "How did you get out here?" "I've been walking for 3 days. I got turned around at Glacier Pass. I knew there was a ranger station somewhere. I remembered it from a map." His story had problems. Glacier Pass was 15 miles away through terrain that would be nearly impassable in this weather. He wore only a light jacket and hiking pants with no pack, no supplies, nothing. His shoes were falling apart, but he was warm. His skin was warm, his breathing was normal. He shouldn't have survived. "Come inside," I told him. "I'll call down for a rescue." Inside, I made tea and radioed Matlock, giving him the coordinates and description of the hiker. "Dakota, listen carefully." Matlock's voice came back thin and urgent. "Do not let him leave the cabin. Do not let him leave until we get there." The hiker heard that. He looked at me with something shifting in his expression. "Why would he say that? You're not safe out there at night." "None of us are." The hiker smiled, and I saw his teeth. They were just slightly too long, and they were moving. Not growing visibly, but I could see them shifting in his gums like they were separate from his body. I reached for my sidearm. He was faster. I don't remember him crossing the room. I just remember his hand was around my throat, and his grip was too strong, and his skin was getting hot like he was burning from the inside. I fired the gun. I felt the kick of it, but he didn't react. He just smiled wider and opened his mouth. The singing came out of his throat, that same orchestral sound I'd heard in the forest, but up close and loud enough to make my vision blur. I fired again, and the impact of the bullets seemed to irritate him more than injure him. He threw me against the wall, and something in my shoulder shattered. Then his head snapped to the side, and suddenly he wasn't looking at me anymore. He was looking toward the radio. "Stay in the cabin," Matlock said through the speaker. "We're 2 hours out. Stay in the cabin and don't engage." The hiker dropped me and picked up the radio. He held it in one palm, and I watched it begin to melt, the plastic softening and running like water. He put it to what might have been his ear, and listened to Matlock's voice coming through the degrading speaker. Then he walked out of the cabin. I watched him from the window. He moved into the forest with an easy, boneless gait that nothing human could achieve. The singing started again, that complex layered sound, and from the darkness around the cabin, other figures emerged. 3 of them, or 5, or 10. The darkness made it hard to count. The hiker, or the thing that had looked like a hiker, became a silhouette against the snow. The singing surrounded it, and the other figures moved in a pattern I couldn't quite follow. Almost like a dance, but with angles and intentions that made my eyes hurt. Then they turned as a group and looked at the cabin. Looked at me in the window. I got my backup radio from the bedroom and climbed to the attic. I locked myself in there with the small window that faces the tree line, and I watched as the things circled the cabin through the night. They didn't try to break in. They just waited, singing their orchestral song, testing my isolation. Around 3 in the morning, I heard the helicopter. The things scattered like they'd never been there. The helicopter made 2 passes and then realized the landing zone was impossible in the snow. It radioed that it would return at first light. Matlock arrived at dawn with a full team. They found me in the attic. They found blood in the cabin. They found bullet casings. They found the melted radio. They didn't find the hiker. It's progressing, Matlock said quietly, looking at the blood. First time it's tried to infiltrate in direct contact. I was airlifted to a hospital in Kalispell. The doctors found 3 bullets in my shoulder and chest, all of them warped and oxidized in ways they said were impossible. They said the wounds suggested exposure to extreme heat. They wanted explanations I couldn't give them. I never returned to the cabin. I resigned from the Park Service 2 weeks later. I told them I had family reasons. I told them I couldn't handle the isolation. None of that was the truth. The truth is that I saw something out in those mountains that wasn't supposed to exist, and it saw me. The truth is that the forests contain things older than the people who walk in them, things that remember when those forests were all there was to know. The truth is that we maintain these parks and these ranger stations not because we've tamed the wilderness, but because we're negotiating a constant, fragile truce with something we can't name or kill or reason with. Sometimes late at night, I hear the singing in my dreams. It sounds almost like someone calling my name, almost like it's trying to tell me something important. I don't answer. I never answer, and I never go back to places with trees tall enough to hide what walks between them. My name is Dakota, and I've been a park ranger in the Appalachian National Forest for 7 years now. People always ask why. Why leave a normal life, a city apartment, steady paychecks, and the certainty of knowing what tomorrow will bring? The answer is complicated, but it starts with the silence. I grew up in a suburb where every moment was occupied with sound, traffic, neighbors, the constant hum of civilization grinding forward. When I was 32, my sister died, car accident on I-75. She was coming to visit me, and a truck driver fell asleep at the wheel. After that, the noise of the city felt like a personal insult. Every siren reminded me that the world continued on, indifferent to loss. I took a leave of absence from my job as a logistics manager, spent 3 months wandering national forests on weekends. In early October, I found myself on a ridge in the Appalachian Range, standing at the edge of a vista where you could see 20 miles in any direction. The mountains rolled endlessly, fold after fold, and for the first time since my sister's funeral, I felt like I could breathe. When I saw the job posting that December, Wildlife and Wilderness Management Specialist, Appalachian National Forest, based out of Black Ridge Station, I applied without telling anyone. I moved into a small ranger station with a cabin and a lake within 2 miles. The salary was a third of what I'd made before. I didn't care. My therapist thought I was running away. Maybe she was right. The work was honest. You monitor trails, check on hikers, document wildlife patterns, maintain the infrastructure that keeps people safe in the wilderness. You enforce regulations, you help lost people find their way back. For the first few years, it was exactly what I needed. The silence of the forest was different from the silence of grief. It was healing, but last summer changed things. It started in July when old Marcus came into the station looking pale. Marcus had been hiking these mountains since he was a kid, 63 years of backpacking experience. He said he'd gotten turned around on the Kemp Ridge Trail near Owl Lake, and when he tried to reorient himself using landmarks he'd known for 40 years, they weren't there, not moved, just gone. He'd walked past the same section of old-growth hemlock 3 times before he realized something was fundamentally wrong with the geography itself. I checked the GPS data, the satellite maps. Everything was where it should be. I walked that trail with him twice. It was exactly as it appeared on every map ever made. Marcus left the forest and never came back. I heard from another ranger that he moved to Florida. That same month, I found the first prints. They were on the eastern perimeter of my territory, near Red Horse Creek. The prints looked almost like elk tracks, but the spacing was off. The gait pattern didn't match any animal I could identify. I photographed them and submitted the images to our state wildlife office. The response came back within a week. Likely artifact of terrain erosion and pareidolia. I knew what I was looking at, and I knew they were wrong. Then August brought the sounds. Around midnight on the 14th, I was reading in my cabin by the lake, a small ranger station with 2 rooms and a porch that faced the water. The night was clear and cold for mid-August. I heard what sounded like elk bugling, but wrong. The pitch was too high and it had an quality that made my stomach clench. It wasn't pain in the sound, it was something else. Hunger, maybe, or a calling that wasn't meant for human ears. I went outside with my flashlight. The sound came again, and my light caught movement across the lake. A shape stood on the far bank, large and dark. I assumed it was a bull elk. The shape turned toward me. and even in the weak beam of my flashlight, something about its proportions felt incorrect. Too long at the joints, too angular. It didn't move like any animal I'd ever seen. The shape lowered its head and walked into the tree line. I swept the flashlight across the forest edge, but it was gone. I stood on my porch for another hour watching the darkness. The forest felt different after that night, not hostile, but aware. By September, other rangers were reporting anomalies. A hiker near Stone Gap claimed he'd seen a deer that walked on its hind legs for nearly 100 yards before dropping to 4 legs and vanishing. A search and rescue team got lost in an area they'd navigated 50 times before. They said the forest had rearranged itself. I knew how that sounded. I filed the reports anyway. The turning point came on the 23rd of September when I found the hikers. There had been a report of a missing couple, James and Rebecca Castile, who'd been hiking the Laurel Hell Trail and hadn't returned when expected. Laurel Hell is notorious for being confusing. It's a section of dense rhododendron thicket that grew so thick that even in daylight you can't see more than 10 feet in any direction. The canopy above blocks out the sky. People get disoriented. They turn around in circles. It's only about a mile long, but experienced hikers have reported that it felt like they spent hours in there. The Park Service recommends hikers rope together and move in groups of at least 3. The Castiles didn't rope up. They went in together on a Tuesday morning. I led the search Wednesday afternoon. 4 rangers, 4 dogs, radio equipment. We found their backpacks within an hour, stacked neatly beside the marked trail, almost like an offering. That was the first sign that something wasn't right. People don't organize their own backpacks when they're lost. We found them an hour later, a mile off trail in a direction that would have required them to fight through dense thicket and cross a ravine they would have had to know was there. They were standing motionless in a small clearing, facing each other, holding hands. At first I thought they were sleeping. Then I saw that their eyes were open, completely open. The whites of their eyes were visible all around, like they'd been scared so thoroughly that their fear had become a permanent expression. Their skin was the color of old paper. When I touched James's shoulder, his arm moved, not under muscle control, but loose and cold, like a man made of canvas. Rebecca's mouth was open, and her tongue was swollen and purple. Both of them were covered in a thin layer of something that looked like dew or frost, though it was 60 degrees in that clearing. We had to carry them out. James came first. He and Rebecca weighed almost nothing, which might have been a mercy. Rebecca's husband walked between 2 rangers, supported on both sides. He never made a sound. At the hospital in town, the doctors found that both hikers were severely dehydrated despite having full water bottles they never opened. Their core body temperatures were 94 degrees. Rebecca had a stroke the next day. James spent 3 weeks in the psychiatric ward before his sister came to bring him home to Ohio. He never spoke. I heard from one of the nurses that when they tried to show him outside through a window, he became so agitated they had to sedate him. That's when the realization crystallized for me. I was the only ranger who had sustained tenure in this territory. The others rotated through. Some requested transfers. A few simply quit the service. Marcus had left after 30 years. The hikers had nearly died. And whatever was happening in the Appalachian wilderness was not finished. So yes, I stayed. Because by then I realized that running away from something is just another form of staying. I stayed because I had to understand, and I stayed because I began to suspect that my presence in the forest, my attention, my witnessing, was the only thing keeping it contained. That was October when I decided to keep a cabin by the lake through the winter. I applied for an extended ranger stayover in the residential station. The request was approved with minimal paperwork. I think by then everyone at the district office wanted me to stay exactly where I was. Now it's December. The snow started early this year. December in the Appalachian Mountains is not like December anywhere else. The cold comes with a heaviness. The snow doesn't fall gently, it accumulates with purpose, piling on branches until trees bend under the weight. The sky becomes a white ceiling that presses down day after day. I've winterized the cabin and laid in supplies. Heat, food, ammunition for my rifle. I've installed additional motion sensor lights around the property and reinforced the windows. People in town think I'm paranoid about bears. Let them think that. On the first real snow night, I saw the deer. It was late evening, around 5 p.m. I was in my kitchen making dinner when movement caught my eye through the window facing the lake. A white-tailed doe was walking along the frozen shore. December visit, nothing unusual, except the way it moved was hinged. Each step was too deliberate, like it was thinking about every joint, every muscle. A real deer moves from instinct. This thing was calculating. I watched for 5 minutes. The doe never looked at the cabin, but I had the strong impression it knew I was watching. When it finally moved into the tree line, its rear legs didn't quite match the speed of its front legs, creating a dragging effect. Subtle but present. I decided to keep a log. I started documenting everything: times of unusual sounds, sightings of animals, changes in the forest behavior, my own psychological state. I wanted evidence. I wanted to convince myself that my observations were real and not symptoms of isolation psychosis. A ranger living alone through an Appalachian winter can slide into paranoia. You have to document things, you have to create structure. December 8th, 11:47 p.m. Sound like an elk bugle again. This time from the northeast, closer than before. Lasted 23 seconds by my watch. Cadence was almost like speech. Patterns suggested intention. December 9th, 2:15 a.m. Woke to sounds of something large moving through the forest. Checked motion sensors. No animals detected. Checked again at 2:47 a.m. All sensors functioning. Whatever moved out there wasn't warm enough to trigger the thermal sensors. December 12th. Afternoon. Found the deer again. Same doe, same dragging motion. I followed it for approximately 300 yards into the forest. It never looked back but moved in a straight line toward the deeper woods. When I reached a certain distance from the cabin, approximately 600 yards, I had a sudden, irresistible impulse to turn around and go back. Not fear exactly, more like the understanding that there was a boundary and I should not cross it. December 15th, 8:30 p.m. Hiked to Stone Gap Ridge. Found tracks. Lots of them, arranged in a circle around a large pine tree. The tracks were neither wholly deer nor wholly something else. But there were 5 or 6 individual patterns, suggesting multiple animals. All of them circled the same tree repeatedly, forming a worn path in the snow. Each circuit tightened, spiraling closer to the tree trunk. At the tree's base, a deep impression in the snow. And in that impression, what I can only describe as matted fur. Not hair. Fur. And underneath the fur, something like bone. I didn't get close enough to examine it. That was the day I realized I wasn't just documenting observations. I was being observed back. The boundary became clearer as the month progressed. There was a perimeter around the cabin and the lake that seemed to be protected, for lack of a better word. Whatever lived in the forest didn't come into the marked zone where I spent my days. I could see signs of their presence at the boundary: broken branches, claw marks on trees, deep prints that appeared and then vanished as if whatever made them had decided not to follow through. But they watched. I could feel it. The sensation was like standing in front of a large window with something on the other side. You can't see eyes because the darkness is too complete, but you know something is looking back. It's a primal feeling. Mammals have evolved to detect predatory attention. When something focuses on you with intention to hunt, your nervous system knows. On December 18th, I set up a camera trap on the edge of my property line. Motion triggered, infrared capable, high resolution. I told myself it was to gather data on wildlife patterns. Really, I wanted to see what was out there. The camera filled a memory card in 48 hours. I downloaded the footage at my desk with trembling hands. Most of it was normal: deer, a coyote, a black bear that shouldn't have been active in December. But there were gaps. 17 separate instances of exactly 2 seconds of blank footage, spaced throughout day and night. The kind of gap you get when something warm passes directly in front of an infrared camera fast enough that the sensor can't resolve an image. Except these weren't brief moments. The timestamps showed these blank sections occurred while I was watching the live feed from inside the cabin. I could see the before and after timestamps. 2-second gap, nothing. Complete absence of image data. Whatever triggered the motion sensor was smart enough to move through the sensor's range so quickly that it couldn't be photographed, or smart enough to know where the camera was pointing. I took the camera down and moved it. Different location, different angle. Next morning, blank footage. Same duration, same placement in the frame where something was moving too fast to be captured. I took the camera down for good. December 20th, I went to town. 15-minute drive. I needed to be around people. I bought groceries I didn't need. I sat in the diner for 2 hours. The waitress, a woman named Carol who's worked there for 30 years, asked if I was all right. I said the winter was just getting to me. She said that happened to everyone sometimes, especially the ones who worked in the forest. She said her grandfather had been a ranger and he'd quit after his first winter. Said the mountains did things to you. I drove back to the station as the sun was setting. When I got to the cabin, I found the front door standing open. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my rifle steady as I cleared the cabin room by room. The single bedroom, the kitchen, the small office space. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. Nothing was disturbed, nothing was taken, but the door had been opened, carefully, and left ajar. I checked all the windows. Locked. I checked for forced entry. Nothing. The lock on the front door had not been compromised. Whoever opened the door had used the knob. I have a gun safe. I opened it. My spare ammunition, my rifle, the 3 pistols I keep secured. All there. That night, I sat in my cabin with every light on, the rifle across my lap, and I watched the dark windows. Around 3 a.m. I heard it. Footsteps on the porch. Not heavy, not light, deliberate. The sound of someone or something walking in a measured, practiced way. The footsteps went around the entire perimeter of the cabin, then stopped at the front door. The door was locked. I could see the knob through the front window. It didn't move. The presence on the other side of the door didn't try to open it. It just waited. I counted the minutes. 1 hour, 2 hours. Around 5 a.m., the presence left. I heard it move back toward the forest in the same measured gait, footsteps clearly defined in the snow. When dawn came, I went out to check the porch. The snow was disturbed, but the prints were wrong. They almost resembled human footprints. The size, the general shape, but the depth and spacing suggested something was wrong with the weight distribution. The heel pressed deeper than the toe, and in places there were claw marks that didn't quite match any animal I'd ever seen. I documented everything. The clock had changed. Whatever had been testing the boundaries of the protected zone had made a decision. The visits were becoming more direct. The hikers found me on December 26th. I was doing my morning circuit around the property when I heard the shouting. 3 people, maybe a quarter mile away on the western trail. I grabbed my radio and hiked toward the voices. There were 2 of them, not 3. A man and a woman, both in their early 60s, dressed in clothes that weren't appropriate for December cold. The man had a bleeding gash on his forehead. The woman was crying. They were from Virginia, they said. They'd been hiking in the area, got separated from their guide the previous afternoon, spent the night in their car at the trailhead, and when they went back out to look for their guide this morning, they'd gotten lost immediately. I tried to locate the guide using the park radio system. No response. I offered them shelter at the cabin while I coordinated a search. That was my first mistake. The moment I let them inside, the cabin felt different. The safety I'd built, the lights, the perimeter, the sense of something kept at a distance, all of it evaporated. The cabin became just a house, empty, exposed. The woman whose name was Jennifer sat at my kitchen table and drank 3 cups of coffee without stopping. The man, Robert, paced. He kept looking toward the windows. "There's something out there," Jennifer said without preamble. "We didn't get lost yesterday. We were being led." I got them blankets and told them to rest. Robert wouldn't stop pacing. Jennifer drank more coffee. Around 2 p.m., I left them at the cabin with my satellite phone and drove out to coordinate the search for the missing guide. It took 6 hours to find him. He was dead, frozen in a ravine near Owl Lake, the same place where Marcus had gotten lost 6 months earlier. His name was David Chen, and he was 34 years old. The Park Service said he'd suffered a fall, possible that he'd gone off trail in the dark, couldn't find his way back, except his body was arranged in the ravine in a specific way. His limbs were positioned precisely, almost ceremonially. His face was turned upward, the eyes open and blank. There was no sign of what might have caused the fall, and the ravine's edges didn't show any evidence of him sliding down. We had to call in a full investigative team. County medical examiner, state police. I had to give statements about why a private guide was operating in the protected forest, what his credentials were, whether I'd approved the hike. It was midnight when I got back to the cabin. Jennifer and Robert were asleep on my couch, wrapped in blankets. I went to the bedroom and tried to sleep but couldn't. Around 2 a.m., I heard movement outside. Not footsteps this time, something dragging. I went to the window and saw Robert standing on the porch, barefoot in the snow. I ran outside. The temperature was 18 degrees. He'd been out there maybe 30 seconds, but his skin was already turning gray. I grabbed him and brought him inside. He was ice cold, his eyes unfocused, and he was repeating the same phrase over and over. "It knows what it wants. It knows." Jennifer woke up screaming. She said Robert had gotten up silently and gone to the door. She said she tried to stop him, but he moved her aside with strength that didn't match his age. She said his eyes were wrong. I kept them inside the next day. The authorities took our statements about David Chen. By evening, Jennifer and Robert's families arrived to pick them up. I was grateful. Robert hadn't spoken since the incident on the porch. Jennifer wouldn't stop talking, her words becoming more frantic as the day progressed. Before they left, Jennifer pulled me aside. "It came to our window last night," she said quietly. "While you were out looking for David, it stood at the glass for almost an hour. Robert and I didn't move. We could see its reflection in the dark window. It had fingers, long fingers. It pressed them against the glass. There's nothing out there that matches that description," I said. "I know what I saw." Her voice had the absolute certainty of trauma. "And I think it let us leave. I think it was deciding whether we were worth taking." After they drove away, I sat in the cabin and assessed what was happening. The boundary had been a courtesy, an agreement perhaps that I would stay contained and the forest would respect the zone. But now the forest had brought me witnesses, the hikers, the dead guide. These were messages, tests. The forest was evaluating me, deciding my status. My status as what? I didn't have an answer. That night I made a decision. I called the district office and told them I was requesting a transfer. I said the isolation was affecting my judgment. I said I needed to step back. The response was kind but firm. I was needed here. No one else would stay. Could I take some personal days? They could send a temporary replacement while I recovered. The temporary replacement arrived on December 28th. Her name was Sarah. She was 26, eager, inexperienced. She was from Michigan and couldn't wait to explore the Appalachian forest. "It's so beautiful here," she said as I was driving her to the second ranger station, 15 miles away. I didn't tell her about the things in the forest. I told myself it was because she'd think I was crazy. Really, I think it was because I was afraid. If I told her, it would become real in a different way. I was still maintaining the fiction that this could all be explained rationally. Isolation psychosis. Unusual animal behavior. Coincidence. That night I felt the boundary collapse. The difference was immediate and physical. The pressure that had been building around the cabin's perimeter released like a held breath. The forest moved closer. The sounds became more distinct. Around midnight I heard the dragging sounds again, but this time they came from underneath the cabin. Not outside. Underneath. I got up and moved to a different room, then a third room, trying to track the sound. It moved under the floorboards, sliding slowly from the eastern side to the western side. It took nearly 20 minutes to traverse the length of the cabin. When it reached the western wall, I heard something I'd never heard before. A sound like vocalization, but without the biological structure to produce it. Not a growl, not a roar. Something like words, if words could be produced by something that didn't have lips or a tongue. Then it was silent. When morning came, I went outside and examined the cabin's foundation. The snow was undisturbed. No tracks. No signs of anything having been there. But around back I found something else. The animal carcass had been placed deliberately on my woodpile. It was a deer, but not recent roadkill. This was a deer that had been dead for perhaps a month, judging by the state of decomposition. Its body had been arranged with deliberation, the legs positioned at precise angles, the head tilted back, the mouth open. Inside the mouth, balanced carefully on the deer's tongue, was a human finger. I recognized it immediately as David Chen's missing index finger. I took Sarah off the rotation the same day I found the finger. I told her there was a mountain lion sighting reported to the south and the station was temporarily unsafe. I drove her to the town of Clearwater and paid for a hotel room for the week. I told her it was bureaucratic precaution. She was disappointed but safe. The finger I placed in a sealed container and locked in my gun safe. I documented photos. I told no one. How would I explain it? The authorities would assume a wildlife predator had transported it, and yet the precision of its placement argued against that. By December 30th, I was operating on maybe 4 hours of sleep per night. I'd stopped filing reports. I'd stopped checking in with the district office. My cabin had become a fortress and a trap simultaneously. The more barricaded I made it, the more the presence of the thing in the forest seemed to press against the walls. My log entries became more frantic. December 30th, 4:47 a.m. It's moving in the forest. I can hear it. Not footsteps. Something else. Multiple somethings? No. One thing moving in patterns that don't match any animal. The snow is falling again. By morning the tracks will be covered. Is that the point? Are these things meant to be temporary? Meant to be forgotten? December 30th, 9:15 a.m. The doe is back. Standing on the frozen lake, absolutely still, has been there for 3 hours, waiting for what? December 30th, 1:33 p.m. It occurred to me that the name Appalachian comes from the Appalachee people. I looked up what happened to them. Displaced, destroyed. The forest is older than the people who named it. What did it do to them? What did they know about what lives in the Laurel Hell and the deep ridges? December 30th, 7:52 p.m. I am not sure if I am psychologically stable. This thought is the one reliable anchor to reality. If I can observe that I might be insane, then I am not entirely insane, but maybe that's what insanity convinces you of, that you're still able to recognize it. December 31st. I'm not going to write anymore, I'm going to watch. That's what it wants anyway. A witness. An observer. Let me be that. Let me see what lives in the dark. On the night before the new year, the thing finally revealed itself. I was sitting in my cabin with the lights off. The fire in the wood stove was down to embers. I deliberately maintained darkness because I wanted to see what would happen. I wanted to stop being blind. Around 11 p.m., the deer came off the lake. I watched it approach the cabin. The dragging gait, the wrong proportions, all of it was clear in the moonlight. But when it reached the porch, it didn't stop. It climbed, its rear legs planted on the edge of the porch railing, and it pulled itself vertical. The body contorted in ways that would have shattered a real animal's spine. The head turned toward the window where I was watching, and then I saw what the deer's face had been hiding. Underneath the skin there was a structure that didn't match the underlying anatomy. The features were too far forward, the eyes were positioned wrong, and in the moment of perfect moonlight, the skin on the deer's face began to slide, just slightly, like something underneath was shifting to find a better fit. The sickness hit me like a wave. Not disgusted. Sickened in the primitive way of a body recognizing wrongness at a cellular level. Then the deer dropped back to 4 legs and walked around the cabin. I heard its hooves on the wooden porch planks, slow, deliberate, examining. When it reached the back of the cabin, it stood up again. This time I heard it clearly, the sound I'd mistaken for speech before. This time I understood that I was hearing the machinery of vocalization, the sliding of things inside a throat that was shaped wrong for human language, the forcing of air through passages that weren't designed for communication. It wasn't trying to speak English. It was trying to speak something else, and I was hearing the attempt as distorted language, because my brain had no framework for what was actually occurring. I won't describe the exact sounds. Some things, once heard, mark you. The deer finished its circuit and moved into the forest. I sat in the darkness for 4 hours without moving. Around 4 a.m., I made a decision. I packed a single bag with documentation, the sealed container with the finger, and essential supplies. I locked the cabin and drove to Clearwater. I collected Sarah from the hotel without explanation. I drove her to the bus station and gave her a month's pay. I told her she was being transferred. I told her to go home to Michigan and not come back. Then I did something I swore I wouldn't do. I called Marcus. I found his number through another retired ranger. He was living in Tampa. When he heard my voice, he knew immediately what was happening. "You see them now," he said. It wasn't a question. "What are they?" I asked. Long pause. "I don't think anyone has ever known," Marcus said. "I think they're old. I think they're smart. I think they learned how to wear the shapes of animals so they could move through a world that wasn't built for what they are. And I think the forest protects them because they're part of the forest in a way nothing else is." "What do they want?" "Witnesses," Marcus said. "People have been hunting them or running from them since the mountains were young. They got tired of the hiding. They got tired of being myths. They want to be seen. By someone who stays. By someone who can't leave." I hung up the phone. I didn't leave. That's what you need to understand about how these things work. They don't force you. They present you with a choice, and every option leads to the same destination. If you stay, you bear witness. If you run, you carry the knowledge forever. The knowledge that something incomprehensible exists in spaces most people never venture into. That you've seen the boundary between what's real and what science says can't be real, and it doesn't match the maps. So I stayed. I renegotiated my position with the district office. I requested to be the sole ranger for the territory. I said isolation suited me. They were grateful. Everyone else had left. I was the only one willing. The cabin is different now. I've made changes. I've built an additional structure 50 yards from the main building, something between a shrine and a blind. I sit there at night and watch. I document what I see. I'm not sure who I'm documenting it for. The agency won't believe the reports. Scientists would dismiss it. The internet would consume it and generate 1,000 false narratives around it. But I keep the records because I think Marcus was right about one thing. They want to be seen. Truly seen, not mythologized or folklored into something manageable, but observed as they are. The doe comes sometimes. The other shapes come more often now. They've stopped hiding their true forms when they're on my property. I've seen things that don't have names. I've heard sounds that my brain can't quite process without playing them back multiple times. In January, the bound hiker came to the cabin. He was still alive but barely. He'd been reported missing 3 weeks prior near the northern ridge. I recognized his face from the search and rescue bulletin. His name was Marcus. Different Marcus, not the retired ranger. And he was missing his eyes, not like they'd been removed. Like they'd never been there. The sockets were sealed over with smooth skin, as if he'd been born without them. His mouth didn't work properly. His hands moved in patterns that suggested he couldn't feel them, but he knew where he was. He moved directly to my supplies and began eating everything, not quickly, methodically, like he was relearning how to consume. His fingers moved through the food and he took bites, chewed, swallowed. It took 2 hours for him to finish one of my preserved meals. I didn't try to stop him. I didn't call for help. I sat and watched, making notes. When he was done, he turned toward me, toward where I was sitting, and made a sound. Not the sliding vocalization of the deer, something almost human, a humming, a frequency, and I understood, without anyone telling me, that this was their language. This was how they communicated things that mattered. I hummed back. It was involuntary. But once I did it, something shifted in the cabin. The pressure released. The watching sensation that had been constant for months eased. The blind hiker left through the front door and walked into the forest. I haven't seen him since, but the other things have stopped coming to the cabin. There's a new boundary now, wider than before. The forest has retreated to a distance of approximately 3 miles from the cabin. I can feel the division between the protected space and the place where they live. I'm not entirely sure which side I'm on anymore. I've been reassigned twice more. New rangers attempt the job. They last days, sometimes hours. I always find them trying to leave, eyes unfocused, unable to explain why they can't stay. I tell them they're having panic attacks. I arrange transfers. They leave grateful. I'm the only constant in this territory, the only witness. It's now mid-January, and the snow is deep. The forest is white and silent. Some mornings I find tracks around the cabin that are almost human, hands with too many joints, feet that splay in directions bones shouldn't allow. I don't feel afraid anymore. That was the trade, I think. The price of witnessing. Fear is the luxury of people who can run. I can't run. And so I've learned to recognize what fear really is when you're looking at something that exists in the spaces between scientific explanation. It's wonder. It's the recognition that there are old things in the old mountains, and they're not hiding anymore. They're just waiting for people like me. People who got lost enough in their own lives that they could never truly leave. Marcus called again last week. "Did it take you?" he asked. "No," I said. "I took it." There was a long silence on the line. "What do you mean?" he asked. "I mean, I stopped running from the thing that killed my sister. I stopped running from grief. And in the space where I stopped running, I made room to see. And what I see is that the world is older and stranger than I was ever told. And that's the thing I needed to know." He didn't respond. Maybe he understood. Maybe he just hung up. I'm still here in the cabin by the lake. I'm still a park ranger, though the paperwork suggests I exist in a kind of bureaucratic limbo. I file reports that no one reads. I maintain a territory that officially contains only normal wildlife and normal terrain. But I watch, and what watches back has learned my name. In January, I heard it called out from the forest. My name, spoken in a voice that had learned to form human words. Not perfectly, but with clear intent. That's when I realized I'm not the witness anymore. I'm the thing being witnessed. I wonder sometimes what will happen when I finally understand that distinction. When the boundary between observer and observed collapses entirely. When I look in a mirror and see that I've been changing, my movements becoming too fluid, my joints bending in ways, and I understand that I've been worn like the deer, like the hiker. But I don't look in mirrors anymore. I just keep my records and sit in the dark. And I listen to the sounds in the forest, learning the language that has no alphabet. Learning to speak the words that call things down from the old mountains. Learning, finally, why my sister had to die. Why I had to be broken enough to stay. The forest wanted a witness, and I was willing to be one. That was always going to be enough. My name is Jackie, and I've been running from something for 3 years before I finally understood what I was running toward. The position came through a contact at the district office in late August. Ranger Supervisor at Shenandoah Adjacent Preserve, they said, responsible for 40 square miles of designated federal land along the Appalachian Ridge, decent pay, solitude. The kind of work that asks you to disappear into the mountains for weeks at a time, monitoring wildlife, maintaining trails, responding to lost hikers and emergency calls. I took it because I needed to disappear. My previous life had become a photograph I didn't recognize anymore. Divorce proceedings that felt like watching someone else's court case. A job managing other people's databases in a climate-controlled office in a city whose name I've learned not to say out loud. Coffee meetings where everyone laughed at jokes I didn't process. So when the opportunity came to spend 8 months a year in a cabin 15 miles from the nearest paved road, I signed every document they put in front of me. The cabin sat at the edge of Black Horse Lake, a body of water roughly 2 miles long and half a mile wide, oriented north-south, like a dividing line between the world and something else. The previous ranger, a man named Oswin who'd held the position for 14 years, had spent 3 weeks training me in late September. He showed me the radio system, the supply caches, the coordinates of the emergency shelter, the protocols for bear encounters, the water testing kit, the locations of the fire towers and trail markers. He was a careful man, methodical in his explanations, but there was something in his eyes that didn't match his words. On his last day, I asked him why he was leaving. Retirement, he said, though he was only 62. Got a place picked out in Asheville. Quieter there, we were standing on the cabin's porch, looking out at the lake. The sun was setting behind the ridge to the west, turning the water into molten copper. He lit a cigarette, which seemed to violate every safety protocol he'd mentioned that week. You ever hear anything strange out here? I asked. He didn't answer for a long time. Nothing that makes sense if you try to explain it, he finally said. Nothing that happens if you follow the rules. What rules? Don't go to the lake after dark. Don't feed the wildlife, not even the small stuff. Don't investigate unusual sounds. Don't follow anything that looks wrong. Don't go to the ridge on the northern boundary. He tapped ash into the wind. And if you find something that looks like a person but isn't quite right, you turn around and call dispatch. You don't approach. You don't try to help. I thought he was being dramatic, hazing the new ranger with local legends. What kind of thing? I asked. The kind that doesn't have the right number of joints, he said. The kind that smells like rot and pine sap and something underneath both of those that makes your stomach drop. The kind that calls out names it shouldn't know. He left the next morning. I watched his truck disappear into the trees and felt the relief wash over me like cold water. Finally, I thought. Finally, I'm alone. The cabin had been built in 1987. 2 rooms, a kitchen, a bathroom with spotty water pressure, a wood stove for heat, solar panels, and a backup generator. A radio that crackled to life at 7 a.m. and 6 p.m. for check-ins. The previous ranger had left it clean, almost obsessively so. Everything was organized with military precision. I found a notebook in the desk drawer where Oswin had logged his observations for 14 years. I read entries about bear sightings, about the seasonal patterns of the elk herds, about maintenance issues with the trail system, and then, mixed in with the mundane observations, there were other notes. Short entries, brief. October 14. Heard something large moving through the forest near the northern ridge. Could not identify species. Did not investigate. Oh, November 3. Found the northeast fire tower access road blocked by what appeared to be an animal carcass. Severely decomposed. Species identification not possible. Considered burned. Decided to mark area as temporarily closed. Did not examine closely. Oh, March 9. Called out for missing hiker Gregory Moss, age 26. Search called off after 3 days. Found his boot approximately 1.4 miles from where he was last seen. Sole intact, no obvious damage, no body recovered. I told myself these were just the paranoid observations of an older man losing his grip. I told myself the missing hiker was probably a coincidence. I told myself that Oswin had seen bears and exaggerated them into monsters, but I did follow most of his rules anyway. Not because I believed in them, but because they seemed like the kind of caution you adopt for any wilderness position. Stay alert, don't take unnecessary risks, treat the forest as the powerful thing it is. The first week was beautiful. The kind of autumn that exists in paintings. The leaves were at peak color, the air was crisp but not yet dangerous, and the lake reflected everything like still glass. I spent my days walking the trails, testing the water quality at 3 designated points, and making radio check-ins that crackled with static before disappearing into the ether. The dispatcher in the district office, a woman named Portia with a smoker's voice, sounded almost disappointed that I wasn't calling in with emergencies. At night, I sat on the porch with a drink and listened to the forest. There's a particular quiet that descends when darkness is total, not peaceful, quiet like an absence, like something has gone away rather than silence settling in. The trees blocked out the stars, the lake reflected nothing. I could hear water lapping against the rocky shore, and sometimes I heard sounds that might have been animals or might have been something else. By the second week, I understood why Oswin had seemed so hollow. I was hiking the Eastern Loop, checking a camera we maintained to monitor wildlife movement, when I noticed something wrong about a section of forest approximately a half-mile from the main trail. The trees there looked older than they should have, or perhaps they looked like they'd been broken and regrown in twisted patterns. Their bark had a peculiar texture, something between smooth and diseased. I marked it on my map and continued on. That night I heard a sound coming from that direction. Not quite a voice, but close. The kind of noise that makes you unsure whether your ears or your mind is reporting the information. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds, then stopped. I didn't investigate. I stayed inside. I locked the door, which Oswin had mentioned was a habit from his early years here, but that he'd eventually abandoned. "Doesn't matter," he'd said. "Locked or open, the boundaries are the same." The sounds continued through my first month. November arrived with an early cold snap. The lake began accumulating a thin crust of ice at the edges. My supply deliveries came every 3 weeks, hiked in by a rotating group of volunteers from the preserve's network. They never stayed long. They never asked questions about what I'd encountered. And I was encountering things. One morning, I found a deer at the edge of the clearing. Except deer don't stand that way, with their front legs bent backward at the joint, their spines curved in a C shape, their heads rotated nearly 180 degrees to observe something behind them. It was still breathing. Its eyes were wet and aware. When I approached, it made a sound like a child crying in a closed room, and then it moved away through the trees using its legs in a way that made me understand, with a certainty that went beyond logic, that whatever I was seeing was not a disease or mutation. Something was wrong with the world at the edges of my jurisdiction, and it was moving closer. By December, I'd started avoiding entire sections of forest. The northern ridge where Oswin had forbidden me, I didn't approach. The area around the damaged trees became an unmarked zone on my mental map. The eastern shoreline of the lake, I would circumnavigate rather than walk directly. I was essentially confining myself to a smaller and smaller territory, drawing my own boundaries within my own assigned space. The isolation was becoming apparent. I'd see another person only during supply deliveries. The radio check-ins were my only regular human contact, and they'd become compressed, almost ritual in their brevity. Portia would ask if everything was operational. I'd confirm. We'd sign off. That was the entire social infrastructure of my world. I started drinking more than I intended, not to excess, but with a regularity that surprised me. By evening, I'd have consumed enough alcohol that the sounds from outside seemed less threatening. The dark became manageable. The understanding that I was being watched from somewhere I couldn't see began to feel less like paranoia and more like simple fact. On December 3, I found the first body. I was checking a section of trail near the western access point when I saw what I initially thought was a bundle of clothing or trash. The preserve had problems with illegal dumping despite our remoteness. But as I approached, the smell reached me first. Rot and something else, something chemical and organic that my brain couldn't quite catalog. The body had been a man. Still was, in technical terms, but decomposition had progressed far enough that gender was the only clear identification available. The body was too degraded for me to determine cause of death. But the positioning was what struck me. He was arranged in a specific way. His limbs spread in a pattern that suggested intention rather than how he'd fallen. Around the body, in a rough circle, someone or something had placed stones. Not arranged. Placed. The distinction mattered. I marked the GPS coordinates and made the radio call. Portia's voice changed when I told her. The professional distance fell away. She asked if I was certain the person was deceased. She asked if I felt safe. When I confirmed both, she told me to secure the area and await an official investigator. "Don't touch anything else," she said. "Don't attempt identification. Just don't touch it, okay?" The state investigator, a woman named Dr. Ravenna, with gray eyes and the kind of exhaustion that comes from seeing things that shouldn't exist in nature, arrived by helicopter the next morning. She examined the body for 40 minutes while I stood at the perimeter and tried not to think about how the corpse's ribs had been splayed outward, as if something had pushed through them from the inside. "How long has it been here?" I asked. 3 weeks minimum," she said. "Possibly longer. The cold has slowed decomposition, but the animals have gotten to it. The disassembly is consistent with scavenger activity." Scavengers, that was the word she used. As if that explained the pattern of the bones, the careful arrangement of the stones, the way the body had been positioned in that specific geometric formation. "Do you know who he is?" I asked. "Not yet. We'll need dental records or DNA, but we'll find out." She looked at me directly. "The hiking records show that no one has been reported missing in this area for 2 months. This person either died here and wasn't reported missing for an extended period, or they were brought here." After she left with the body, I pulled Oswin's notebook from the desk and reread every entry. The missing hiker, the descriptions of things moving through the forest, the fire tower access road blocked by a decomposed carcass, the careful avoidance of investigation. Gregory Moss, that had been the hiker's name, 26 years old, missing in November of what would have been Oswin's 12th year at the position. I did the math backward. Oswin had been here for 14 years. If a body had been present every 3 or 4 years, that meant he'd found several. He'd walked past decomposing remains of people and recorded the locations with the careful precision of someone documenting a problem they couldn't solve. That night I heard the sounds again. But they were different now, less tentative. They came from closer to the cabin, and they had a quality of testing, of experimenting. I heard what sounded like steps on the porch. I heard breathing against the window. I heard my name spoken in a voice that I might have recognized if I let myself think about it long enough. I didn't lock the door because Oswin was right about that. Lock or open, the boundaries were the same. Instead, I sat with the lights off, the radio volume low, and waited for dawn. Winter closed in. The lake froze completely by mid-January, creating a solid surface that extended from shore to shore. I'd been warned about this by Oswin, though he'd been vague about the specifics. "Don't go out on the ice," he'd said, "even when it seems solid." I had no reason to go out on the ice, but I began to notice things in the center of the lake. Marks in the snow, trails that seemed to lead from one side to the other, but when I examined them with binoculars from the shore, the pattern became apparent. They weren't straight lines. They curved and looped. They suggested something moving with legs that weren't arranged in the conventional sense. On January 17, I heard breaking glass from inside the cabin. My heart seized. I was in the bedroom, and for a moment I couldn't move. The sound came again, a deliberate crack, followed by the wind pushing at the broken pane. The window in the main room had been shattered from the outside. Shards lay across the floor in a pattern that suggested something had pushed through rather than struck the glass. I found strands of what might have been hair tangled in the broken frame, but it was matted with something darker, something that might have been blood. I called Portia on the radio, and this time there was no attempt to hide the concern in her voice. "Are you safe right now?" she asked. "I'm inside," I said. "The window is broken, but I'm inside. I'm sending someone out. It will take him at least 6 hours to reach you by foot. The roads are bad. Lock yourself in a room that isn't the one with a broken window." "Do you have a weapon?" I had a rifle. Oswin had left it in a cabinet with a note. "In case of emergency." Federal policy, I never used it. The ammunition was still in the original box, untouched. "Yes," I lied. "Okay. Stay on the radio, check in every 30 minutes. Don't go outside." I boarded up the window with wood I found in the storage shed, working as quickly as my shaking hands would allow. The moment the plywood was secured, I felt the sensation of something withdrawing. The presence that had been pressing against the outer walls seemed to draw back slightly. I wasn't safe, but I was contained. The volunteer ranger who arrived the next afternoon was a young man named Declan, probably mid-20s, with the kind of face that suggested he'd never thought seriously about death or pain or the ways the world could break itself. He examined the broken window, documented it, and made sympathetic noises while looking everywhere except at my eyes. "Oswin never mentioned anything like this happening," I said. "Oswin's gone," he replied, which wasn't quite an answer. After he left, I made a decision. I pulled out the maps I'd been developing in my own notebooks, the territories I'd mapped based on sounds and signs and the specific gravity of wrongness that seemed to emanate from certain locations: the northern ridge, the malformed forest, the section of shoreline where the water never quite froze properly. And in the center of all of it, marked on Oswin's records with increasing frequency in his final years, the deepest part of the lake. I began to understand that this wasn't random. The body I'd found had been positioned deliberately. The window had been broken with intent. The sounds were a form of communication, a testing of boundaries, and the center of it all was the lake itself. That night I heard something that stopped my breath. A human voice, clear as if it had come through the radio, speaking from outside the cabin. It was a woman's voice, and it was calling for help. I knew what it was. I understood, in a way that bypassed all rational explanation, that something was imitating a person in distress. But knowing that didn't completely override the animal instinct that wanted me to respond. The voice had the specific quality of genuine desperation. It knew how to sound frightened. It knew how to make me want to open the door. I sat and listened to it for 20 minutes. After a while, it stopped. There was a sound like liquid being poured, a wet slapping against the wood, and then nothing. My isolation became total. I stopped taking the normal trail routes. I stopped checking the cameras except from positions I could monitor from the cabin's windows. I was no longer surveying the territory. I was being surveyed. I was contained in a space that was shrinking as my understanding of what was beyond the boundaries grew. By late February, Portia was calling me twice a day for check-ins. She never quite said it, but I could sense that other rangers in the district had experienced similar things. There were territories that remained empty because no one would accept the position. There were regions marked on maps with subtle notations that seemed to warn about something that couldn't be officially documented. "How much longer is your contract?" she asked during one of the check-ins. 4 months, I said. "Unless I extend." There was a long silence. "Would you consider leaving early? There's a position opening up at Cold Mountain. Completely different territory, much better staffed, less remote." Part of me wanted to accept immediately, but I found myself saying no. I'd begun to understand something about the nature of this place, and I needed to understand it more fully. Oswin had run away. The body I'd found had belonged to someone who couldn't escape, and somewhere in the space between those two outcomes, there was a truth about this territory and what it contained. On March 1, I made a decision to approach the deepest part of the lake. I didn't tell dispatch. I prepared carefully, bringing everything I thought I might need, and I waited until midday when the light would be at its best. The ice was solid, or seemed to be. The surface held my weight without cracking. But about halfway out from the shore, I began to notice details that made my movements more cautious. The snow had been disturbed in a pattern that was almost like a spiral leading toward the center. The ice beneath the snow had a particular quality to it. A transparency that seemed to show something moving below. When I looked down, I saw them, not one, multiple. Their shapes were difficult to process, they were large, and they moved with a kind of intelligence that was apparent in every gesture. Their bodies didn't conform to any skeletal structure I could recognize. They were long, impossibly long, and they bent in ways that suggested too many joints. Their heads were featureless except for the presence of what might have been eyes, but positioned in places where eyes shouldn't be able to form or function. They were aware of me. I could feel the sensation of observation, of focused attention, but they didn't approach. They circled beneath the ice, maintaining a distance, watching. I understood then what Oswin had meant about the boundaries. These things existed in a specific place. They didn't cross onto land, and they didn't approach in the daylight unless something had broken the rules. They were contained in the lake, or they chose to be, or they existed in some state where the distinction between containment and choice became meaningless. I backed away slowly, not running, not breaking eye contact with the vague space where I sensed their attention. When I reached the shore, the ice held perfectly. I walked back to the cabin without looking behind. That night I called Portia and told her everything. I told her about the things in the lake, about the body, about the sounds and the testing and the careful boundaries that Oswin had tried to respect. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, there was a long silence. "We're going to bring you out," she said finally. "Tomorrow morning. I'm sending a helicopter." But it was already too late, because I'd broken the rules, and the boundaries had shifted. The helicopter came at dawn on March 2. Declan was with the pilot, along with a woman I didn't recognize. They sat down in the clearing near the cabin. I had my pack ready. I'd been waiting by the door, watching the arrival with a sense of relief that felt almost like waking from a long nightmare. But the pilot wouldn't let me approach. He was waving me back, his mouth moving, but I couldn't hear anything over the sound of the rotors. Declan was pointing not at me but at something behind me. I turned. They stood at the tree line, 3 of them, standing upright in a way that violated how their bodies should have moved. Their proportions were wrong in a way that hurt to observe. They were calling out in voices that sounded almost like human speech, almost like they were trying to form words, And as I listened, I began to recognize the sounds as my own voice, my own patterns of speech, twisted and repeated and distorted. The helicopter lifted before I reached it. I watched it rise, heard the sound of the rotors increasing, felt the wind that pushed me back toward the tree line. The figures didn't advance. They stood and watched as the aircraft climbed and turned and disappeared into the sky. And then, very slowly, they seemed to notice me again. The closest one tilted its head, a movement that involved the entire upper body rotating in a way that bodies shouldn't be able to move. I ran back to the cabin. Behind me, I heard the sounds escalating, voices that were becoming more human, more familiar. I could hear my mother calling for me, my ex-wife apologizing, old friends laughing at jokes I'd made years ago. The sounds were coming from multiple sources, multiplying, layering over each other until the noise was thick and suffocating. I locked the door, though I understood now that locks meant nothing. I turned on the radio with shaking hands and reported the helicopter evacuation failure. Portia's voice came back immediately, but I could barely focus on the words. She was saying something about the emergency shelter, about hiking north toward the fire towers where they might attempt a second evacuation. Get away from the lake, she was saying. Go north. Can you do that? I understood then. The helicopter hadn't come to rescue me. It had come to fulfill an obligation, to document that an attempt had been made. But everyone who worked in this territory knew that some positions couldn't be abandoned mid-term. Some rangers didn't leave. Over the following hours, I packed what I would need for a long-term stay. Not to survive, though survival was still possible, but to exist in this new arrangement where the boundaries had shifted and I was no longer the observer but the observed, no longer the ranger maintaining order but something existing in the ordered space between the human world and the regions that didn't follow human rules. The supplies would last me through spring. My contract was through June. Perhaps they would extend it. Perhaps by then I would understand the nature of what I was being asked to maintain. Oswin's notebook made more sense now. Every careful notation was an act of witnessing, of documenting the existence of something that couldn't be officially acknowledged but needed to be tracked. As darkness fell on March 2nd, I heard the sounds evolve again. They were less imitative now, more themselves. They were moving through the forest with increasing frequency and boldness. I could hear them on the porch. I could hear them testing the boards I'd installed. But they weren't aggressive. They were curious. They were learning. They were understanding the shape of the boundary between their territory and mine. I opened Oswin's notebook and began to write. March they. Late evening. Attempted evacuation was unsuccessful. Helicopter was dispatched. Circumstances prevented rescue. Understand now that the boundaries are permanent. These positions exist to monitor and document. The previous ranger understood this. Observed anomalies in the lake for 14 years. Did not attempt to explain or investigate thoroughly. This was the correct approach. The entities beneath the lake appear to be intelligent. They recognize individual humans. They test rules and boundaries. They have learned the location of the cabin and the patterns of human behavior. They are not aggressive if boundaries are maintained. The body found in January, I now understand it belonged to someone who violated the protocols. Hikers who go to the northern ridge don't return. Humans who approach the lake boundary after dark aren't heard from again. Gregory Moss, who disappeared 14 years ago, most likely ventured into prohibited territory. The sounds at night that imitate human voices. This is communication. Possibly an attempt at language. Definitely an attempt to understand human behavior and psychology. They are learning. Every night, the imitations become more sophisticated. I have accepted employment here not as a ranger maintaining federal property, but as a caretaker of a boundary. The job is to maintain the rules that keep human territories separate from theirs. The job is to survive here, to endure and to note what happens. Oswin survived for 14 years. I am now beginning to understand why he seemed so hollow when he left. The sounds have become louder as night deepens. They are calling from the lake and from the forest. They are multiplying. There are more of them now than there were this afternoon. They have learned something from my rule breaking. They have learned that I am available for study. I will continue to check in with dispatch. I will continue to document. I will maintain the boundaries as I have been instructed, though those instructions were never spoken aloud. The rule is simple. Stay inside after dark. Don't venture past the marked territories. Don't attempt to escape. Don't help the lost people, because they are not people anymore. If you break these rules, the boundaries shift, and you become part of what is being studied. I am not afraid anymore. Fear requires the possibility of escape. I understand now that there is no escape. There is only the deep hungry calling from the dark. learning human sounds, testing human walls, understanding that it has all the time in the world. I have accepted the job. I will maintain it. My name is Coda Whitebear, and I've been a seasonal ranger in Yellowstone National Park for 3 years now. I'm not a full-time employee, never will be if I'm being honest with you, but the work keeps me sane in ways I can't fully explain to my family back on the Crow Reservation. They ask why I chose this job, why I patrol alone in the backcountry for stretches that sometimes run 14 days without seeing another living soul besides the animals. My mother thinks I'm running from something. She's right, but not in the way she means. I accepted this job because I needed to disappear. Not vanish permanently, but evaporate into something larger than myself. At 34, I'd spent a decade in Billings working construction, then restaurant management. Then the kind of dead-end work that grinds you down year by year until you forget what your own voice sounds like when it matters. The job posting came up in March 2019. I saw it on the NPS website at 2 in the morning, and I knew before I'd finished reading the full description that I was going to take it. The pay is modest, the work is demanding. You're on your feet sometimes 16 hours a day, managing trails, checking campsites for bear damage, locating lost hikers, checking water quality samples, and documenting wildlife patterns. The cabin they assign you isn't much, a small research station called Pelican Overlook, positioned on a northern lake bed about 7 miles from any maintained road. No electricity, no running water inside the main cabin, though there's a hand pump at the well. 2 rooms, both fitted with wood stoves that require constant attention in the cold months. I told the hiring manager, Derek Hollis, that I wanted the remotest post available. He raised his eyebrows at that. Derek's been with the NPS for 17 years. He's seen plenty of people request the backcountry assignments. But there's something about the way I asked for isolation that must have registered differently. He asked if I had experience working alone. I told him I grew up in a house with 6 other people and spent my 20s wanting nothing more than empty space. That was enough for him. The job started in May. I drove up from Billings with everything I owned in a truck that had 140,000 miles on it. The mountains hit you differently in spring. Snow still clings to the higher peaks, but the lower elevations explode with green. The Lamar Valley was thick with bison. I remember stopping the truck halfway up the northern road and just watching them graze, their massive forms moving with surprising grace through the sagebrush. I thought about my grandmother's stories, the ones she told about the old hunters and how they moved through the land with respect, how they understood that they were guests in the world of the animals. Derek drove me out to the cabin on my first day. The road deteriorated significantly after the last maintained turnout. We were driving over what was basically an overgrown fire break, the truck bouncing over rocks and through dried creek beds. The morning was clear and warm, maybe 55 degrees, the sun heavy and good on the windshield. You've got radio contact every evening at 5, Derek explained as we drove. The main station is at Silver Gate, about 12 miles south. If there's an emergency, you hike or drive to the northern ridge where you get cell service. Takes about 40 minutes on foot. There's an emergency beacon in the main cabin. Use it if you absolutely need immediate help. What kind of emergencies happen out here? I asked. Derek kept his eyes on the trail. Wildlife encounters, mostly. Lost hikers who thought they could make it farther than they actually could. Injuries, weather. Every few years someone doesn't come back from a day hike. Every few years we find them. Not always alive, but we find them. The cabin appeared around 11. It sat on a gentle rise overlooking Pelican Lake, a massive body of water that stretched north for what looked like several miles. The tree line was thick, lodgepole pine and some aspen mixed in. The shoreline had a rocky beach that descended into clear water. I could see fish moving near the surface. This is beautiful, I said. It is, Derek agreed. And it's also completely unforgiving. The lake gets down to 10 degrees in January. The snow can pile up past the windows of the cabin. The animals here don't see you as a person. They see you as either a threat or an opportunity, depending on what they are. You respect that boundary. You stay alive. You blur it. We find your remains in August. He wasn't being dramatic. This was genuine advice from someone who'd seen the actual consequences. Derek walked me through the cabin. The main room had 2 cots with heavy wool blankets, a cast iron stove, shelves stacked with canned food and bottled water, first aid supplies, and a radio. The back room was smaller, filled with filing cabinets and equipment. There were binoculars, camera equipment for documenting wildlife, measuring equipment for trail surveys, logbooks, and maps. The maps covered every inch of the walls. topographical, vegetation patterns, historical wildlife migration routes. You're here to observe and document, Derek said. Anything unusual, you log it. Anything dangerous, you report it. Anything that seems wrong, use your judgment. What would seem wrong? I asked. He paused at the window, looking out at the lake. You'll know it when you see it. Most people who spend time out here, I mean real time, not tourists taking selfies, they develop a sense for when something's off. The birds stop singing, the animals act territorial in ways they normally don't. The light feels different somehow. I didn't fully understand what he meant at the time. I understand it now. The first 3 months were exactly what I needed. The isolation was absolute and clarifying. I fell into a rhythm. I woke with first light, usually around 5:30. I made coffee on the wood stove using grounds I filtered through cheesecloth. I reviewed the previous day's notes and planned my patrol route. I spent the days hiking different sections of my territory, recording observations in the logbooks, animal sightings, vegetation changes, weather patterns, any signs of human activity outside the permitted areas. The wildlife was extraordinary. I saw elk herds numbering in the hundreds, wolves, grizzlies from a safe distance, bison moving through the valley with an almost ceremonial slowness, birds I'd never seen before. At night, I sat on the porch with coffee or tea and watched the sky. The stars out here are a kind of violence. There are so many of them and they're so bright that looking up at them can feel like looking at something that has weight and presence. By August, I'd settled completely into the work. My logbooks were meticulous. Derek came out once in June to check on me and seemed satisfied with my documentation. He asked how I was holding up. I told him honestly that I felt more stable than I had in years. He nodded like he'd heard that before. The first thing I noticed different was the ravens. Ravens are common in Yellowstone. They're intelligent, vocal, and they follow people around, scavenging food waste. I'd seen dozens of them during my first 3 months. They're mostly black, with some iridescence in their feathers, and they call out constantly, that distinctive raven croak that echoes off rock walls. In the second week of August, I noticed that the ravens in the northern section of my territory had stopped vocalizing. I was hiking a ridge trail about 2 miles northeast of the cabin when I first saw them. There were maybe 20 ravens perched in a dead lodgepole pine, completely silent. They were positioned along the branches like something had arranged them. They watched me pass without moving. I logged it as unusual behavior and kept moving. 3 days later, I found one of the ravens dead near the lake shore. It was positioned deliberately on a flat rock, wings arranged at its sides, head tilted back. There was no visible injury, no predator damage. It looked like it had died and someone had arranged the body respectfully. I didn't touch it. I photographed it and logged the location. By the end of the month, I'd found 7 more ravens in similar positions around the lake, all arranged, all without obvious cause of death. More concerning was the behavior of the larger animals. The elk herds had always moved through the valley in predictable patterns. They grazed during early morning and late evening, bedded down in the thicker timber during the heat of the day. By mid-August, they were behaving erratically. I'd see the same herd twice in one day in different locations, sometimes appearing restless and agitated. On several occasions, I watched elk run for no apparent reason. No predators visible, no obvious threat, just sudden panic and movement through the forest. The wolves I'd seen occasionally, moving purposefully through the valley. They were the apex predators in this region, and they acted like it. Focused, efficient, clear about their goals. In August, I started seeing wolves that didn't fit that pattern. Once, I watched a wolf walk in circles on a ridgetop for nearly an hour. Not a territorial circle, but an actual repetitive spiral, like the animal had lost spatial awareness. I reported all of this to Derek in my mid-month radio check. Could be the heat, he suggested. Animals act strange when it gets over 90 degrees. That elevation up there. Sometimes the animals get stressed in summer. It wasn't over 90 degrees. The maximum was in the mid-70s. Could also be just variation, Derek said. You're going to see individual animals act weird sometimes. That's nature. I supposed he was right, but something about it didn't sit right. My grandmother used to talk about the difference between animals that were sick and animals that were being affected by something external, something that worked through them like a parasite or a spell. She'd describe it as animals that had been touched. She meant it literally, like something else had put its hands on them and rearranged their insides. The call came through the radio on August 27th, mid-afternoon. It was Derek, and his voice had the tight, controlled quality that people use when they're managing panic. "Coda, we've got a situation. 2 hikers reported missing, last pinged from a location about 4 miles south of Pelican Lake. That's in your territory. Can you head that direction and keep your eyes open? On my way, I said. The hikers were a couple, mid-50s, from Missoula. They'd registered with the park office that morning, telling the ranger they were planning to hike a trail that should take them 5 hours. They'd been due back at their campsite at Mammoth by 6. It was now 4 o'clock, and they hadn't arrived. Their last cell phone ping had come from a location that was actually deeper into the park than where they said they were going, suggesting they'd gotten significantly lost. I took the main trail heading south, moving faster than I normally would. The light was starting to take on that particular quality that I'd learned meant the sun was lowering, still hours away from actual sunset at this elevation in August, but the angle was changing. The forest was quiet in that attentive way it gets when something large is moving through it. I found them about 1.5 miles from the main trail, off on a smaller game trail that probably shouldn't have been used by hiking parties. They were walking away from the direction of their campsite, moving deeper into the forest. "Hey!" I called out. They both jumped. The man was tall and gray-haired, wearing hiking boots that looked expensive and well-maintained. The woman was shorter, with a shocked expression on her face like she'd just woken up. "We're rangers," she said quickly. "We knew we were off trail. We were just trying to find our way back." "You're going the wrong direction," I said, coming up to them. "Mammoth is that way." I pointed southeast. "You're heading northeast, deeper into the backcountry." "We know," the man said. "We've been trying to get back for about an hour now. The trails look the same. We just kept walking, thinking one of them would lead us out." I pulled up my GPS unit and marked their location. "I'm glad I found you. This area gets pretty active at night. Wildlife. You don't want to be hiking in the dark out here." As I was talking to them, I noticed something odd. Both hikers had their eyes on the forest to the north, in the direction I'd come from. Not obvious about it, but their attention was clearly divided between talking to me and watching the tree line. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Did you hear that noise?" the woman asked. "What noise?" "We've been hearing it for maybe 20 minutes. It sounds like, I don't know, an animal, but it's not right. It's not any animal we recognize." I listened. The forest was quiet, just the normal ambient sound, breeze through the trees, some birds, the distant sound of the stream that fed into the lake. "I don't hear anything," I said. "It stopped," the man said. "Right when you showed up, it stopped." I got them turned around and started leading them back toward the trail. We were maybe 200 yards from the main path when I heard it. A sound from deeper in the forest, maybe a 1/4 mile north. It was low and long, something between a moan and a growl. It didn't sound like any bear or wolf I'd ever heard. It had a quality that made my nervous system register it as deeply wrong, the way you might react to a scream without recognizing it as a scream specifically. The hikers both froze. "What the hell is that?" the man asked. "Probably an elk," I said, and I was grateful that my voice sounded steady. "Sometimes they make sounds people don't recognize. Let's keep moving." But I was lying. It wasn't an elk. And the fact that it stopped making noise when I approached, just like the woman said, indicated something that was actively avoiding me. We got the hikers back to the trail and made the hike back toward Mammoth in about 1.5 hours. They were quiet for most of it. As we were walking, I noticed more of the ravens. They were in the trees, perched singly or in small groups, all silent, all watching us pass. The hikers made it safely back to their campsite. Derek called me on the radio at 7 to say they'd arrived. He thanked me and told me to stay safe. I told him I would, and I meant it. By the time deep autumn settled in, I documented the behavioral patterns with a precision that bordered on obsessive. I had 43 pages of notes on unusual animal activity. The ravens were long gone, but I'd found more of them dead, always arranged, always without visible cause. The wolves had mostly left the area. The elk herds had become erratic in their grazing patterns, sometimes standing in groups without moving for hours, then suddenly bolting in random directions. The temperature dropped. By mid-October, nights were freezing. By early November, the first serious snow came. I'd prepared for it. Derek had helped me stack wood, install a more robust covering over the well, and secure equipment. The cabin was well insulated, and I kept the wood stove running most of the day and night. It was on November 8th that I found the first one. I was hiking the eastern shore of the lake, checking on a group of geothermal features to ensure the trail markers were still visible under the increasing snow. The beach was rocky in that section, leading to thick forest about 50 feet inland. I wasn't actively looking for anything. I was just doing my job. The elk carcass was half buried in snow, positioned in a small clearing just back from the shoreline. It was a bull, probably 5 or 6 years old, with a decent rack. It had been dead for maybe a week, maybe longer. The snow had preserved it, and the cold had slowed decomposition. But here's what made me stop and stare. The animal was positioned on its side, its legs arranged parallel to its body in an almost anatomically formal way. The head was tilted back, mouth open, and there was a pattern in the snow around it, maybe 10 feet in diameter, where something had walked in tight circles. I documented it with photographs. I didn't touch the body. I was trained to report wildlife deaths, not disturb them. But I circled the area carefully, looking for predator sign. There should have been wolves or bears who'd fed on the carcass. There should have been ravens and magpies. There was nothing. No tracks, no blood pattern, no evidence of anything having approached this dead animal at all. In the next 2 weeks, I found 3 more elk in similar positions, all arranged, all without evidence of predation or scavenging, all surrounded by circular walking patterns in the snow. The snow got heavier. By late November, I was dealing with 3 to 4 feet of accumulation, and the wind was significant enough that I had to be careful about whiteout conditions. I stayed closer to the cabin, restricting my patrols to a 2-mile radius except on clear days. It was during this period that I started hearing the sounds at night. They came during deep cold snaps when the temperature dropped below zero. They were vocalizations from the forest, not the normal night sounds of animals settling in or hunting. These were deliberate, rhythmic sounds, a moaning pattern that would rise and fall, sometimes for hours. It never sounded quite like anything I recognized, but there was an intelligence to the pattern that separated it from natural animal behavior. It would stop when I opened the door to the cabin, as if the animal producing the sound was monitoring the cabin's activity. I started keeping a log of when the sounds occurred. Always on the coldest nights. Always between midnight and 4 in the morning. Always stopping if I made noise outside. In my radio call with Derek on November 20th, I asked if he'd heard of other rangers reporting similar sounds in other parts of the park. "There's always some sound out there you can't identify," he said carefully. "The more time you spend in the wilderness, the more you become aware of how much is going on that you're not equipped to understand. Sounds carry differently. They distort in ways you can't predict. Something 5 miles away might sound like it's a quarter mile. Something high-pitched might reach your ears as low-frequency rumble." "This sounds intentional," I said. Derek was quiet for a moment. "How intentional?" "Like something's learning the parameters of the area, testing responses." "You need to get some sleep," Derek said, and there was genuine concern in his voice. "Isolation can do things to people's minds. You start interpreting natural patterns as meaningful because you're looking for meaning. It's not dangerous, but it can make you start seeing connections that aren't really there." I didn't argue with him, but I knew what I was hearing, and I knew it wasn't a cognitive artifact of isolation. The winter solstice passed. The shortest day of the year came and went, and the light began its slow return. But the sounds intensified in that last week of November and the first week of December. They came earlier in the evening now, starting around 9 or 10, and they were different, more varied in pitch and pattern. Sometimes I would hear what sounded like language patterns, rhythm and emphasis that suggested communication rather than just animal vocalization. I was running low on firewood by the second week of December. The snow had made gathering new wood impossible, and I was down to the last quarter cord. I calculated I had maybe 6 days left before I'd need to either leave the cabin or find some way to gather more. I hadn't been prepared for a winter this severe. Derek had assured me that the November resupply run would include firewood. But the supply run had been delayed by bad weather, and now the weather was too bad to manage even a supply run. I called Derek on December 10th to report the situation. He said they'd try to get a supply helicopter out in the next few days if the weather cleared. If not, he said, they might need to extract me before the roads became fully impassable. I didn't want to leave. I can't fully explain why. The logical part of my brain understood that I was in a potentially dangerous situation. Low fuel, winter storm potential, increasing isolation. But some deeper part of me understood that leaving now, before understanding what was happening in this forest, felt like a betrayal of some kind. Of the land, of myself, of the purpose I'd come here to find. "I can make it," I told Derek. "Just get the supply run out when you can." That night, the sound was different. It came around midnight, and it wasn't outside the cabin. It was inside my head. Not an auditory hallucination, but a sense of presence that was so overwhelming that it took me several minutes to realize there wasn't actually a physical sound. The moaning pattern I'd been hearing for weeks was suddenly manifesting as pure perception. I could feel it moving through the cabin, circling the wood stove, examining the walls. I lay on the cot with every muscle locked, my hand on the survival knife that I kept within reach, knowing with absolute certainty that the blade wouldn't matter against whatever was moving through the air above me. It lasted maybe 20 minutes. Then it was gone, and there was just the normal cold darkness of a winter night in the high country. I didn't sleep. I kept the stove going and sat by the window, watching the moonlit snow, thinking about the patterns I'd documented. The arranged bodies, the circular paths, the way the animals had moved with purpose that wasn't their own. The silence when I appeared, the cessation of sound when I made noise. My grandmother had told me stories about the time before the reservation, about the old territories and the things that lived in the deep places of the world. She'd talked about beings that weren't quite animal and weren't quite human, things that existed in the spaces between categories, that could move through the world in ways that didn't follow normal patterns. She'd called them by names in Crow, words that didn't translate cleanly to English, but the sense was always the same. They were hungry, and they tested boundaries, and they learned through observation. They walk where there is emptiness, she'd said once, where one person alone has created a pocket of silence in the world. That's where they're drawn. I understood now what she meant. I'd come to this place because I wanted emptiness. I'd wanted to disappear into the landscape and dissolve my identity into something larger. And in creating that emptiness, I'd created an invitation. On December 12th, in the afternoon when the light was still reasonable, I made the decision to leave. Not because I was afraid, but because I understood that staying would only intensify whatever pattern had been established. The supply helicopter had been delayed again by weather. The roads out were barely passable, but I could make it to the northern ridge where I had cell service, call for extraction, and get out of the territory. I packed methodically. Everything I'd learned I logged in the final entries of the observation books. Everything I'd seen I documented with precise detail. I took the maps of unusual activity patterns and sealed them in plastic. I left the cabin as it had been when I arrived, except for the windows which I left open to let the cold clean out whatever had accumulated in the air. As I was preparing the final entry, I heard the sound one more time. Not from the forest this time. It came from inside the cabin, from the corner where I was working. It lasted only a few seconds, but in those seconds I felt something brush against the back of my neck. Not a physical touch, but a presence that was so immediate and real that I knew I was no longer alone in the cabin. I didn't look behind me. I finished the entry, sealed the logbooks, and walked out into the December afternoon. The hike to the ridge took 4 hours. The snow was deep, and the wind was picking up. Behind me, I could hear the forest sounds, but different now. The arranged animals hadn't made sounds. The circling patterns hadn't produced noise. What I was hearing now was something else. Something that was moving through the territory in a different way, following the presence that had been learning the landscape through the winter. I made the ridge at sunset. The cell reception was weak but functional. I called Derek and reported my position. I told him I needed extraction. He asked if there was an emergency. I said not exactly, but my seasonal assignment needed to end. It took 2 days for them to get a helicopter out. I spent those 2 days at the ridge station, monitored the area through binoculars, and watched the patterns of movement in the forest below. The animals that had been behaving abnormally had left the territory. What remained were the normal patterns of winter survival: elk moving to lower elevations, wolves hunting, ravens calling. It was as if something had released its grip on the landscape, or as if it had simply moved on to another pocket of emptiness elsewhere in the wilderness. The helicopter came in on December 14th. The pilot was professional and didn't ask questions about why I was being extracted mid-season. Derek met me at Silver Gate and asked directly what had happened. I told him the truth. He listened carefully, and when I was done, he said something I didn't expect. I had a ranger, years ago, who was assigned to the Pelican Overlook Station. He lasted 4 months. When he came out, he had observations very similar to yours. Arranged animals, behavioral changes, sounds that didn't fit any known wildlife. He documented everything meticulously, just like you did. What happened? I asked. He transferred to Death Valley. Spent 5 years there. Then he quit the NPS and went back to school. He's a professor now at UC Berkeley, teaching environmental science. He told me that he understood something out there that he couldn't explain, and that the understanding wasn't something he could carry into normal life. The moment you tried to talk about it in a way that normal people could understand, it lost its reality. Did he figure out what it was? I asked. No, Derek said. But he logged everything just like you. The data is remarkable, the patterns are consistent. Whatever it is, it's been doing this for a long time. I've thought about that conversation many times in the years since. I left the NPS after that season. I work in Billings now, managing a hotel. I live a normal life. But I kept copies of the logbooks and I review them sometimes, looking at the patterns and trying to find language for something that exists in the space between observable fact and folkloric truth. What I know is this. There are places in the wilderness where something moves through the landscape with intentional purpose. It learns by observing. It affects the animals in ways we don't yet have a framework to explain. And it's drawn to solitary people who create pockets of isolation, empty spaces where it can test the boundaries of communication and presence. I don't know what it is, but I know it's real, and I know it's still out there, in the deep territories where human habitation is sparse and the wilderness maintains its dominion. And I know that if you spend enough time in those places alone, you'll sense it too. That particular quality of attention that means something else is noticing you back. The sounds I heard that winter were never just animal calls. They were attempts at something like conversation. And though I left the territory before whatever was making those sounds could fully articulate what it wanted to communicate, I often wonder what it was trying to say. Sometimes, on the coldest winter nights, I stand outside and listen to the darkness, half hoping to hear that pattern again. Not from Yellowstone this time, but from wherever it is I am. It never comes. That kind of presence, once it has been recognized and then departed, doesn't follow into ordinary life. But I remember the arrangement of the dead ravens. I remember the circles in the snow around the elk. I remember the sensation of something moving through the cabin air like a thought taking physical form. And I remember that in the deepest part of that winter wilderness, something was learning how to reach across the boundary between the animal world and human consciousness. That boundary, I now understand, is thinner than most people know. My name doesn't matter much anymore. The application I filled out for the Park Service used the name I was born with, but that life, the one where I commuted to an office in Pittsburgh, where I sat under fluorescent lights processing insurance claims, that version of me is so far removed now that I barely recognize it. What matters is what I chose to become. I was 34 when I submitted the application. I'd been divorced for 2 years, no children, no attachments except a rental apartment I hardly spent time in, and a therapist who'd recently suggested I might benefit from finding purpose in something tangible. I appreciated her irony about the word choice, though I never told her so. The job posting came across my email in February. Seasonal ranger position, Tamarak Ridge Station, Appalachian National Forest. 6 months. Remote assignment. The posting emphasized solitude, self-reliance, and the ability to work without regular human contact. It was as if someone had written it specifically for a man trying to disappear. I wasn't running from anything dramatic. No crime, no scandal, just the slow suffocation of a life that felt borrowed from someone else's instruction manual. I'd grown up in West Virginia, in the foothills where my grandmother's house still stood empty after her death. The mountains were in my blood in a way nothing else ever was. I could barely remember what trees looked like from an office window. I couldn't recall the last time I'd breathed air that didn't taste like climate control and resignation. The application asked why I wanted the position. I wrote something honest but professional. I explained that I'd worked seasonally in environmental conservation during graduate school, that I understood wilderness protocols, that I was seeking to return to meaningful work aligned with my values. None of it was untrue. It just wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth was that I wanted to be alone in a place where silence was the default, where I wouldn't have to perform normalcy, where the rules of society felt like optional suggestions rather than iron requirements. They called me for an interview in early April. The Ranger District Supervisor was a woman named Kerrigan, probably in her late 50s, with a face weathered by actual sunlight rather than the matte pallor of office fluorescence. She asked me technical questions about trail maintenance, wildlife safety protocols, and backcountry first aid. She asked about my solitude tolerance. I answered everything directly. At the end, she studied me for a moment longer than felt comfortable. Most people who want this job are either running from something or towards something, she said. What's your situation? I told her the truth. Both, probably. She nodded like that was the answer she'd needed. I started the job on May 15th. Kerrigan drove me to the station herself, her truck climbing higher into the ridge country until the sky seemed to come down around us. The road deteriorated from asphalt to gravel to something barely deserving the name of road. The forest pressed in closer with each mile. We didn't talk much. When we reached the station, she killed the engine and sat quiet for a moment. "The cabin's stocked," she said. "There's a radio for emergencies. You'll have weekly supply runs on Wednesdays. Anyone lost comes through the emergency line. Your first priority is coordination with dispatch. You're not a rescue operative. Your eyes, ears, and a steady presence. Don't play hero." I nodded. "One more thing," she added. She turned in her seat to look at me directly. "People live out here, not in the towns, in the deep woods. Families that have been on this land longer than there was a park service. They come through sometimes. They're not dangerous if you're respectful, but they're territorial about certain areas. If you get marked trail, stay on marked trail. If someone tells you an area is closed, you close it. No questions, no bureaucratic pushback. You understand?" "Who are they?" I asked. "People who don't want to be found, which means if you respect that, you won't find them, and you'll be safer for it." I should have asked more questions. I should have pushed for specifics. Instead, I just said I understood, and Kerrigan left me there as the sun descended toward the western ridge. The cabin was small but well maintained. Stone foundation, wooden walls stained dark, a solar panel system on the roof, a propane stove, a radio mounted on the wall beside a laminated emergency protocol sheet. There was a cot, a table, a shelf of books left by previous rangers. The window faced out toward the lake, a perfect mirror of reflected sky in the late afternoon light. Behind the cabin, a steep trail descended through dense forest toward the water. I could hear the small dock creaking in the slight breeze. The lake itself was large but narrow, bound on both sides by cliffs of ancient stone, forested with hemlock and oak that leaned toward the water like old men trying to see their own reflections. I made coffee on the propane stove and sat on the cabin's small porch. The forest sounds were unfamiliar at first, not the absence of sound but a different arrangement of it. Wind through specific species of tree, water moving against stones, the calls of birds I'd have to relearn. Under everything, a baseline hum of insect life, so constant it almost felt like the forest's own breathing. I thought about Kerrigan's warning. People in the deep woods. Families. Territorial. I decided I wouldn't worry about it. I had my marked trails, I had my protocols. I had my willingness to respect boundaries. That was the last clear-headed decision I remember making. 3 weeks into the assignment, the radio crackled to life at 6:47 in the morning. I was on my second coffee, reviewing the week's patrol schedule. It was Kerrigan's voice, compressed through the speakers into something angular and stripped of nuance. "Ridge Station, we have a 1022. Missing hiker Blue Trail corridor, last ping on their device 2 hours ago. You're closest, can you respond?" A 1022 meant a lost or disoriented person. I was 15 minutes out from the start of the Blue Trail by vehicle, maybe 4 hours from the most likely location if they were stable and waiting. I grabbed my pack from the shelf by the door, where I kept it always prepared. Radio, first aid kit, water, energy bars, emergency whistle, map and compass in addition to the GPS unit I'd been issued. "Ridge Station responding," I said into the radio. "En route to Blue Trail Junction, ETA 8 minutes. The hiker's name was Marcus Webb, 46 years old, experienced enough to know better than to panic, not experienced enough to have developed the subtle forest skills that separate surviving from just not dying. He'd gone out for a day hike yesterday afternoon and hadn't returned to the parking area. His wife had called the ranger station at dawn. The Blue Trail was one of the main routes, well marked, moderate difficulty, a 4-mile loop with significant elevation change. It should have been difficult to get seriously lost on. But the forest is patient. The forest has infinite ways to break good plans into component parts. I found Marcus in a gully at mile 2.3, sitting with his back against a massive oak, his right leg elevated on a moss-covered log. He'd twisted his ankle badly the previous afternoon, misjudged a wet section of trail in declining light, and realized too late that attempting to descend further in the dark would be more likely to kill him than sitting put. He'd made good decisions. He'd stayed in place. He'd rationed his water. He'd oriented himself toward a fallen log that would offer some protection from the temperature drop. When he saw me coming down the trail, the expression of relief on his face was so pure it almost hurt to witness. "Thank God," he said. "I thought I might be out here longer." "You did everything right," I told him, and I meant it. I examined his ankle, badly sprained but not broken, as far as I could tell. I wrapped it with the elastic bandage from my kit and helped him to his feet. The hike back to the trailhead took twice as long as normal. We moved slowly, carefully, Marcus leaning on my shoulder at the worst sections. By the time we reached the parking area where the ranger service had stationed a vehicle, the sun was beginning its descent. Marcus's wife practically pulled him from the truck, sobbing with relief and anger in equal measure. I reported the situation back to Kerrigan. Incident resolved. Hiker stable, transferred to wife's care, recommended professional medical evaluation. Good work, Kerrigan said. Get back to base, we'll have another ranger cover patrol for the rest of today. I drove back to the station as shadows grew long between the trees. Somewhere during the rescue I'd become aware of something I couldn't quite articulate. A sense of the forest's attention. Not metaphorical, not poetic. An actual sensation of being observed by something with the full weight of its focus directed at me. When I got back to the cabin, I told myself it was just the adrenaline of the rescue, the unusual social interaction, the hours of concentration in an unfamiliar part of the territory. I was tired. I was adjusting to the isolation. My nervous system was recalibrating to a life without the constant low-grade stimulation of urban existence. That night I heard sounds around the cabin I couldn't identify. Not animals, not wind. The forest seemed closer than it had before, the darkness beyond the windows more absolute. I checked the locks on the doors and windows, which was ridiculous. This was a ranger station, not a fortress. Lock meant something against human intruders, not against the forest itself. I sat by the window and watched the reflected lamplight move across my own face in the glass, trying to construct explanations for the feeling of something huge and breathing just beyond the visible boundary of my world. The second week of June brought reports that didn't fit patterns. The radio system was supposed to carry mostly routine dispatches, trail conditions, permit updates, occasional emergency calls, but starting in mid-June we began receiving reports from other ranger stations and local law enforcement about people who hadn't come back from hikes. 3 individuals in a month, 3 separate incidents, different trails, different circumstances. Each one resolved eventually. The hikers found, usually confused about time and distance, usually unable to explain exactly what had happened. One woman reported losing an entire day. She'd started a morning hike, stopped for lunch, and when she checked her watch again, only 3 minutes had passed on the digital display, but the light suggested it should have been early evening. She'd pulled off the trail to examine her watch more carefully, and suddenly it was nearly dark. She'd bivouacked on the forest floor and been found the next morning by a search team less than a mile from the main trail. A man reported hiking for what seemed like 30 minutes before realizing he was back at the parking area where he'd started. The Park Service's distance markers, which he could see clearly, suggested the route should have taken at least 2 hours. The third report came from a group of 4 teenagers. They'd gone missing for 6 hours but reported that only 2 hours had passed according to their collective sense of time. What disturbed me most was their description of the sounds they'd heard. Like someone calling, one of the girls told the ranger who found them. But the voice was inside out. When I relayed these reports to Kerrigan during my weekly supply run, she told me I was overreacting. Forest does things to perception, she said, loading canned goods into my pack at the ranger station. Lack of visual markers. The way sound moves through trees. People get disoriented. It's normal. 3 cases in a month. Same stretch of forest. We're entering summer. More hikers. The law of large numbers. Also, she paused, considering her next words, there are reasons some areas of the forest have reputations. Not all of them folklore. What's that supposed to mean? She sealed the top of a container of coffee grounds with a sharp gesture. It means respect the forest. Respect the boundaries people have set. You'll be fine as long as you do that. I wanted to ask her about the people in the deep woods again. About the territories Kerrigan had warned me against. I wanted to ask her what she knew about whatever was disrupting time and perception on the marked trails. Instead, I took my supplies and drove back to the station. That evening, I examined the map more carefully than I had before. There were several areas marked in red ink, with the notation closure, natural features, do not enter. The closures formed a rough pattern, concentrated in the northwest sector of my territory, radiating out from something called Shale Ravine. The feature itself was marked on the topographic map, a deep gouge in the landscape that extended for nearly 3 miles before seeming to split into smaller tributaries of stone and dark water. I recognized the name from Kerrigan's earlier warning. People didn't go there. People respected the boundaries. And now I wondered if the time distortions on the marked trails were somehow connected, some kind of echo of whatever presence inhabited the ravine itself. That night, I heard something calling from the direction of the lake. It came repeatedly, rhythmically, like someone learning to use their voice and testing different configurations of sound. High, then low, then a strange lateral sound that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly against my ribs. I sat on the cabin porch with a flashlight and a borrowed rifle from the emergency storage locker and waited for dawn. By late June, the calls grew more distinct. Not words, but something trying to become words. I stopped going outside after dark. I stopped taking the main trails. I checked the supply radio constantly for any news, any explanation that might make sense of what was happening. Then came the night the figure appeared at the edge of the lake. I woke to scratching at the cabin walls. Not aggressive scratching, methodical, like something testing the integrity of the structure, trying to determine if it could be breached. I grabbed the rifle and went to the window facing the water. The figure stood at the far end of the dock, silhouetted against the last remnant of starlight reflecting off the dark water. It was tall, not impossibly tall, but disproportionate in ways that made my brain struggle to interpret what I was seeing. The proportions were wrong. The angles between joints didn't suggest the engineering of an ordinary animal. As I watched, it turned its head toward the cabin. I could see the shape of its profile for only a moment before the darkness reclaimed it. What I'd seen in that moment, the position of the jaw, the structure of the skull, the angle at which it held itself, suggested something old, something that had learned to arrange itself in a shape vaguely resembling bipedal motion, but without any particular commitment to the form. It stood there for 20 minutes. I didn't move. I barely breathed. When it finally turned and walked into the forest, it did so with a gait that was less walking and more a fluid articulation of limbs and joints finding the path of least resistance down the slope. It disappeared into the hemlock forest like water running downhill. I called Kerrigan on the radio at 4 in the morning. "There's something here," I said. "Static." Then, "Define something. A creature. At the lake." "I don't know what it is." "What did it do?" "It stood on the dock. It looked at the cabin. It left." Another long silence. I could almost hear her thinking through the quality of the static between us. "Lock the doors. Don't leave the cabin. Don't attempt any patrols. I'm calling this in. Stand by." 2 hours later, 2 additional rangers arrived at the station. Neither of them met my eyes. They spent the first hour reviewing the log of incident reports and examining the topographic maps I'd circled with notes. Then they asked to speak with me privately, away from the cabin. We walked down toward the lake in the full light of early morning. The dock was exactly as I remembered it, except for the tracks. There were tracks in the soft earth at the dock's edge. They were indistinct, like something had dragged or slid rather than walked. But the stride length suggested something 7 feet tall, at minimum. "There's a group of people who live on the upper ridges," one of the rangers said. His name was Dervin. He was older, maybe in his 60s, with the careful speech of someone who chose words like he was paying for them individually. "They call themselves keepers. They're not hostile if you leave them alone, but they protect certain areas. They take that responsibility seriously." "The figure I saw wasn't human," I said. "No," he agreed. "It probably wasn't." "Then what was it?" Dervin looked back toward the cabin, then back at me. "The forest provides for people who know how to ask. That works both ways. There are debts, there are bargains, there are things that have lived in these mountains longer than any nation has existed. The people you'll see, some of them aren't entirely people anymore. And the things you'll see, some of them are trying very hard to appear human enough that you'll leave them alone." "That's insane," I said. "Probably," he agreed. "But you saw the tracks, you heard the sounds, you saw the shape at the dock. You can't unsee those things. Now you have a choice. You can finish your contract, keep the closures closed, avoid the ravine, and have a quiet summer. Or you can push, and you can ask questions, and you can spend a lot of time being afraid." The other ranger, whose name I never learned, pointed toward the marked closures on the map. "Stay within the marked territory. Respect the boundaries. If you see one again, go inside and lock the doors. Don't investigate, don't follow. Just wait it out." They left before noon, their truck climbing away from the station without anything resembling a formal goodbye. I was alone again, but the solitude felt fundamentally different now. The cabin was no longer a refuge. It was a small pocket of exemption carved into a larger territory that wasn't mine and had never been meant to welcome me. That night, I heard more sounds. Multiple voices, not from the dock this time, but from deeper in the forest, from the direction of the ravine. They were calling back and forth, and I realized they were talking about me, not in language, in a system of vocalization that was more about the shape of intention than actual words, but unmistakably discussing my presence at the lake. My proximity to something. I understood then why Kerrigan had warned me about marked trails. The missing time reports. The disorientation. They weren't random phenomena, they were tests. Something was learning the boundaries of my attention, determining how far it could push before I'd become a problem worth addressing. The question was whether I'd already crossed that boundary. July came to the ridge, and with it a heat that seemed to rise from the stone itself. The forest changed in subtle ways I couldn't articulate but could feel. The animals grew scarce. The birds that had been constant disappeared into some deeper silence. Even the insects seemed diminished, operating at a reduced frequency, as if the landscape itself were holding its breath. I maintained my patrol schedule, the marked trails, the quarterly maintenance. I filed my reports with Kerrigan, each one carefully worded to avoid any reference to what I'd actually experienced. Other hikers came through, mostly in the early morning or late afternoon, avoiding the heat and, I suspected, avoiding whatever time and perception shifts occurred in the ravine sector. I found evidence of habitation in sectors marked closed. Not permanent structures. Camps, places where people had stayed for periods of time. One site had a circle of stones arranged in a specific pattern, with bones at the center that I recognized as human. Ancient. Decades old, at least. Maybe centuries. I didn't touch anything. I didn't investigate further. I marked the location and reported it to Kerrigan as human remains requiring official processing. "We'll handle it," she said over the radio. And then, "You're doing good work out there, just finished the season." But there was something in her voice that suggested the remains I'd found weren't a surprise, that the bones at the center of that strange pattern were exactly what she'd expected to hear about. In the final weeks of my contract, a woman came to the station. I was checking the water filtration system when she emerged from the forest like she'd been part of it the entire time. She was probably in her 50s, though her age seemed negotiable, something that shifted depending on how the light caught her face. She wore clothes that looked handmade and expensive, the way expensive things look when they've never been within sight of a mall or a sales rack. "The ranger," she said. Her accent was local but shaped by something older. "You're the one who's been watching." "I'm the seasonal ranger," I said. I didn't move. I didn't invite her inside. "Yes. And you've respected the boundaries we set. That's why I'm here." She looked at the lake, at the dock where the thing had stood. "There's a hunger that's very old. It doesn't have a name in your language. The closest would be the word from the far north. The people there have been living beside it longer than almost anyone. Wendigo is how they pronounced it, in their way." I said nothing. "It's not evil," she continued. "That's a human word. It exists. It hungers. It's been here since before the land was named differently than it is now. The people who came first, they learned to live beside it. They made bargains. They offered certain things, in certain places, in certain seasons. The hunger was satisfied, and everyone else was left alone." "The bones," I said. "Yes. Some of those are old enough that no one remembers the names. Some are more recent. People who didn't respect the boundaries. People who thought the forest was just a place to take pictures and return home unchanged." She turned to look at me directly. "The hunger has been patient with you because you're not native to the deep land. You're still learning. But it's aware of you. It's very interested in the shape of your fear." "What do you want?" I asked. "I want to give you a choice the ranger service didn't mention. You can leave. Go back to your offices and your fluorescent lights. Forget what you've seen. In a month your eyes will start reinterpreting the memories. Your brain will reshape them into something more acceptable. A bear, maybe. A mountain lion. Something your civilization has already decided can exist. Or you can stay. Finish your year. Learn the real patterns of the land. Accept that some boundaries exist for reasons that aren't stupid or superstitious, even if you don't fully understand them." She paused. "The hunger is changing. Climate is changing. The old bargains don't hold the way they used to. We need people who understand both worlds, people who can be rangers in more ways than the Park Service intended." She left before I could answer. She walked back toward the forest, and I didn't see her depart so much as realize she was no longer present. I sat on the cabin steps for hours. I thought about my old life, the insurance claims and the fluorescent lights. I thought about the fact that I'd come to the forest looking for something to matter, and the forest had taken me at my word. It had shown me something that mattered, something immense and irrevocable. I was still sitting there as dusk descended, when I heard the calling again, the same voices, the same strange articulation of sound that resonated in my ribs like a secondary heartbeat. But this time it didn't sound like hunger, it sounded like welcome. In early August, I requested an extension of my contract. The Park Service approved it. My new end date was set for February. 1 full year. On the first night of the extended contract, I went to the lake and waited on the dock. The moon was just past full, bright enough to cast shadows, bright enough to see the shape rising from the water with clarity that no longer shocked me. It was larger than the previous visits, almost 13 feet tall when it straightened fully. Its joints articulated in directions that shouldn't have been possible. Its head turned toward me with the slow intention of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment. I didn't run, I didn't close my eyes. I stood and met its attention directly, and in doing so accepted something I couldn't name. I'd come to the forest looking for a life that mattered. The forest had agreed to the bargain. Now I was learning the cost. This is the account you requested. The truth, as much as I can shape truth into language that your readers will accept without total rejection of consensus reality. I'm submitting it now in the final weeks of my year at Tamarak Ridge Station. In a few months, I'll return to the broader world. I'll be changed in ways that won't be visible until someone looks closely at my eyes. The memories of what I've learned will fade just as the woman predicted. My brain will reshape the experiences into something more palatable. A series of unusual encounters with isolated individuals. Natural phenomena that coincided with my own psychological unmooring from society, but I'll know the truth underneath. And when the Park Service receives the next seasonal ranger assignment application, I'll help with the interview process. I'll look for the people who are running towards something, not from. I'll find the ones who understand that the forest isn't something to be conquered or managed. I'll guide them to the boundaries and teach them what respect looks like. Because the woman was right. The hunger is changing. The climate is shifting the boundaries. And something old and patient is learning that the world might be becoming a place where it doesn't have to hide anymore. Tamarak Ridge teaches you how to listen. And once you learn to listen, you never quite stop hearing. Even from miles away. Even after you've left. Even when you're back in the offices under the fluorescent lights, the forest continues its conversation. And some of us now, we're learning to answer back.